Okay, g'day, mate. Luke Ford here. I want to talk about the power of nations and measuring what really matters. And we'll start with political science professor here, Michael Beckley.
This is Sean Jones. I'm the editor of the quarterly journal International Security here at the Belfer Center at the Harvard Kennedy School. Today I'm talking to Michael Beckley. He's an assistant professor in the Department of Political Science at Tufts University. He's also the author of a new article in International Security, The Power of Nations, Measuring What Matters. The article appears in the fall 2018 issue of the journal, which is now online and has been published in print and mailed to libraries and subscribers. Thanks very much for being here today with us, Mike.
Thanks for having me, Sean.
I think you've written a great article. I would like to hear more about it. Why is this topic important? Why does power matter?
Yeah, first of all, I think a lot of vital life and death policy decisions hinge on accurate assessments of the balance of power. So for any country, who are our enemies? What are our major threats? When and where should we use military force? How should we allocate our budget? To answer any of those questions, you need an accurate assessment of the balance of power. The second is for scholars. So power is literally the central variable in everything that we do. For us to be able to create theories that explain something about the world, we need an accurate assessment of power in the same way that a physicist needs an accurate measure of energy or an economist needs an accurate measure of money. It's really central to everything we do.
You have something to say, something new to say about an old topic here. What's the basic argument of your article?
Well, the purpose of the article is to show that the way we've been measuring power for decades now is really screwed up. It distorts our view of the balance of power, and then to provide a new way to measure power that better captures reality.
We've already talked a little bit about this idea of power. Can you give a simple, clear definition of what power is?
I think the simplest definition is just the ability of a country to get what it wants. So the ability to shape world events in line with its interests. Now that's a very nebulous definition, and so a lot of what we have to do as scholars is come up with proxies that measure that fundamental capability.
Well, when it comes to measuring power, your article has a lot to say. How do journalists, analysts, policymakers, and scholars currently measure power?
By far the most popular way is to basically equate power with size. So big countries look very powerful, and to just measure power with gross indicators of economic and military resources. So GDP, gross domestic product, is probably the most popular indicator of power, and it just simply adds up all of the goods and services produced in a country in a given year. Another popular indicator is just using military spending and the size of a country's military. Some people add in trade volumes or number of ships or industrial production. The bottom line with all of these standard indicators is they just tally up all the economic and military assets in a country in a given year.
Well, those certainly sound like the fairly common ways that power is measured. What's wrong with measuring power that way?
Yeah, the problem with the gross indicators is that they add up all of the assets that every country produces, but they don't deduct the costs that every country has to pay to provide services for its people, to police and protect its population. And so as a result, these gross indicators systematically exaggerate the power of countries with big populations. So China, India, these countries obviously have very large economies, they have large militaries, but they also have massive welfare burdens because they have to take care of more than 1 billion people. They have huge security burdens because they have to protect that huge population. And so you need to subtract out those costs in order to measure power accurately.
Okay. Well, that makes sense. The idea that you should somehow take into account the costs of being a big and apparently powerful country. And it's not just the bigness that contributes to the power of that country. But how do you do that? How do you measure power and take into account those costs?
Yeah, so just like financial analysts will analyze a business not just in terms of its gross profits, but also its net profits. What is left over after you subtract out all of the production costs and all the other costs that going into running that business. I basically do the same thing for countries. I measure their economic and military resources in net terms. And that basically involves creating a balance sheet for every country where assets go on one side of the ledger, liabilities go on the other side, and you just subtract the liabilities from the assets to get a rough estimate of how much net wealth and military power does this country have to project abroad and exercise power internationally.
What you're saying makes sense, but how can we be sure that the way you...
So when I think of power, I immediately think of East Oakland. So what's going on in East Oakland right now? How are they dealing with this shutdown? Probably some very creative ways that they're using to deal with the pandemic.
Crazy.
Well, I better turn off the sound on this or YouTube will get me in trouble. But somehow I know President Trump is to blame for what we're seeing. So far our how do you phrase this politely? Our communities that often cause social unrest by committing disproportionate amounts of crime, so far they don't seem to have been completely off the hook. So far they haven't gone wild, but I know a lot of people are preparing for essentially riots and massive civil unrest. So from Beverly Hills to all around the nation, retailers prep for unrest. So you can find boarded up stores seen from SoHo. That's in New York City, right? Beverly Hills, the Pottery Barn and West Elm stores near Rodeo Drive were spotted with boards across windows. So bar owners are boarding up restaurants amid the coronavirus outbreak.
This is Savannah Hernandez for Action 7 News. Today is Wednesday, March 18th. Now, South by Southwest is supposed to be here in Austin this week, but as you guys can see behind me,
Okay, I didn't cue that up at the right place, but yeah, restaurants are boarding up across the nation for this kind of massive civil unrest, and stores in New York, San Francisco, Seattle, Chicago, Paris, Vancouver, elsewhere are similarly boarded up.
Now, South by Southwest is supposed to be here in Austin this week, but as you guys can see behind me, 6th Street is completely empty. Not only that, but to our surprise, a lot of the bars are actually boarding up their windows. Now, normally at this point in the year, these streets would be filled with people to the brim. They usually have this area closed off because there's thousands and thousands of people here just on this street, going to the bars, networking, meeting new people because of South by Southwest. And as you can see, we've seen a couple of pedestrians, but mostly there's just homeless. We talked to a restaurant owner and he was telling us that people are barring up their restaurants, their bars here on 6th in fear of the fact that, you know, there's only homeless down here at night. They're not sure based on what's happening in other states, like for example in Philadelphia, police are no longer going to be arresting people for burglary, vandalism, theft. So they're getting ready here in Austin for that to potentially happen. They're boarding up their windows, and this is what the coronavirus epidemic has done to the economy here in Austin, Texas so far. So first off, we're here at the Chupacabra on 6th Street in Austin, Texas. Is this your guys' restaurant? Were you guys just hired to come and board it up, or what's going on?
This is our bar.
This is your bar?
Uh-huh.
So why, I noticed that there's a lot of bars on this street that are boarded up.
Sure.
How come?
We're just following suit from the other bars. So we saw these bars putting boards on there, so we figured there's a threat, you know, and since no one's going to be down here, we never know what may happen, so figure out better be safe than sorry.
What do you think may happen? Why do you think that it's such a threat that you need to board up?
We've just seen a lot of homeless people still out and about at nighttime, and I mean the cops are here as well, but we figure that if we take the reason for them to break in away from it, I mean. So
notice how the basis for his decision, he saw other bar owners doing the same thing. So that is a pretty good heuristic. Okay, you've heard the word heuristic. Elites love to use the word heuristics. Heuristics. Okay.
Heuristic.
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 Okay, so heuristic technique is any approach to problem solving or self-discovery that employs a practical method that is not guaranteed to be optimal, perfect, or rational, but which is nevertheless sufficient for reaching an immediate short-term goal. So following what other businesses are doing is a pretty practical
heuristic.
Heuristic.
heuristic,
So it's kind of weird that this word has become so ever present. Has it just exploded in the past year or two? So examples that employ heuristics include trial and error, rule of thumb, or an educated guess. But just following what everyone else in your business is doing is a pretty practical method for making decisions. So when finding an optimal, perfect solution is impossible or impractical, heuristic methods can be used to speed up the process of finding a satisfactory solution. So we may have hundreds of choices to make each day, and we can't devote a great deal of time and energy to making our choices, all of them anyway. So we often depend on doing what everyone else is doing, depending what everyone else in our field is doing, or depending on certain elites. Say, for me, in reacting to coronavirus, I'm taking most of my cues for how to understand it from Steve Saylor. He's my favorite public policy commentator. So, most fundamental heuristic is trial and error. And here are a few commonly used heuristics from George Pollier's book, How to Solve It. He was a Hungarian mathematician. So if you're having difficulty understanding a problem, try drawing a picture. If you can't find a solution, try assuming that you have a solution, seeing what you can derive from that, working backward. So another way to describe that is apodictic logic, where you reason from inference to a possible outcome and then see how that works. If the problem is abstract, try examining a concrete example and try solving a more general problem first. A more ambitious plan may have more chance of success. So in psychology, heuristics are simple, efficient rules learned or inculcated by evolutionary processes that have been proposed to explain how people make decisions, come to judgments, and solve problems when facing complex issues or incomplete information.
Then we won't get as many problems happening.
It's just safety precaution with the homeless, because we're pretty sure they're going to try to break in and get whatever they can, because they're out on the streets while everybody else has a safe place to go. So everybody down here, we all follow the same suit. We're all going to board up our bars, just so we make sure our alcohol and stuff inside our bars are safe.
We can't make that decision because there's a few more offices in there, so it really goes back to...
It would go back to the landlord. I'm sure that they're thinking about it for sure. I mean, I would, just because with nobody around, it's just sort of a safety precaution here. And so we'll see. Hopefully it's not necessary, but I would definitely go on and board up if I were a business with no employees that are going to be in and out on a daily basis.
So Mayor Adler passed that new ordinance that said no groups no larger than 10 until, I believe, May 1st. So are you guys going to be boarded up and closed until May 1st?
Correct. Yeah, we're definitely going to follow the rules.
So if police are announcing that they're not going to arrest people, if judges and politicians are releasing all sorts of people from prison, people facing trial for things like murder are getting released, so society could break bad in a dramatic fashion. So yeah, boarding up your store seems prudent to me.
We kind of understand, why we're doing it. It's sort of, again, it's for preventative maintenance, until they get it under control. It's unfortunate because it costs the bar industry a ton of money, and the artists, and it takes a lot of the relief of people getting stress away from, drinking or whatever and enjoying their time. But ultimately, I think, Austin's pretty resilient, really good, group down in Austin. So, well, it'll come back. It just takes time, and I'd much rather, we come back with, less threat of the coronavirus spreading than the other way around.
And that was going to be my next question. South by Southwest was supposed to be this week and next. Not only that, but it's warming up. We have a big tourist destination here in Austin, Texas. A lot of people come to 6th Street every single weekend throughout the week. How big of a hit is your bar personally taking? Have you had to lay off workers? What's going on out here? Oh,
tremendous. South by is the biggest, 2 weeks of the year. A lot of bars depend on South by to take them through the year. And we've had to lay off, just about everyone. It's unfortunate, but, it's just one of those things that no one could foresee.
We didn't lay off any employees. We just let them know they will be off. So we have a lot of people that has bills to pay, probably not going to be able to pay them because obviously they're not working. South by Southwest is one of our big money days. So that time we have no money to be made for that. So it's like very hard for anybody that's in the bar industry. So everyone's struggling pretty bad.
I mean, it was, devastating. We thought this was going to really be a big point for us. We're a startup. We've been in business about 2 years. We're supposed to participate in a ton of events. Obviously.
So I think there are going to be a ton of behavioral changes flowing from this coronavirus. So I think many people are going to get into the habit of ordering as much as they can online. They're going to find that they like having their groceries delivered. And so Amazon and Walmart, I think, will just get even stronger. And then what about religion? Maybe after a while, people will find it empty to continually distract themselves to death. So people, millions and millions of men are detoxing from sports addiction right now. And many of them may find that they are better off without sports addiction. So maybe they will make some fundamental changes. Maybe they'll never go back to sports addiction. Anyway, here's Michael Beckley on the power of nations measuring what matters.
You would have us measuring power is superior. What's the historical and the empirical support for why your method is the way that's better than the traditional method?
So I provide 3 pieces of evidence to support my argument. The first is I look at great power rivalries over the last 200 years. So these are situations where you have 2 great powers going at each other for 25 years or more. And I basically take the reader through the history of how those rivalries played out, which country ultimately ended up coming out on top. And I show that indicators of net power do a much better job tracking the rise and fall of the great powers over the last 200 years. The second piece of evidence is to look at war and dispute outcomes. So we have big data sets with, thousands of international disputes and hundreds of international wars. And again, I find that net indicators can predict roughly 80% of the outcomes. Who's going to win these wars and disputes and who's going to lose? Whereas the standard indicators that most of us have been using perform little better than a coin toss at predicting. They're barely better than 50% when trying to predict outcomes.
Can you give me an example?
So let's say people get tired of distracting themselves to death, right? People no longer can distract themselves with sports, for example. So what are some fundamental changes that are likely to come to thousands of people's lives? For example, I think more people are praying now than have prayed perhaps in my lifetime. So it's not that their prayers will necessarily be answered. Maybe the process of praying to God will open up parts of themselves to the power of the transcendent, or to the power of introspection, or some kind of soul cleansing that may go on for people in the process of prayer, that becomes a permanent habit. So I will think that at first thousands of people will react to this shutdown by trying to distract themselves, but eventually the distraction will prove empty. So where do people then search for ultimate meaning? They can no longer distract themselves with sports. They can no longer distract themselves with going to parties or to concerts or going to bars. And so people are being forced to introspect. And a lot of people are going to find out, 1, they have no hobbies, they have no passions, they have no interests. 2, they're going to find out that they don't like themselves very much. And 3, they're going to find out that other people don't like them very much either. For example, how many people have checked in on you over the past week? If it's fewer than half a dozen, then you're in trouble. You lack connection, human connection in your life. You apparently don't have many people who care about you. Now, if you have more than a dozen people checking in on you, then I think you're in pretty good shape in that regard. But we can all improve the quality and the depth of our human connections. So people are going to come out of this, and I think they're going to see that some of the ways that they've been leading their lives simply don't work. For example, sports addiction. For example, going to bars, trying to socialize yourself, trying to party yourself to distraction from whatever's bothering you. Maybe this will launch a return to religion. Maybe this will launch a turn to 12-step programs. People will look for a way of living that works. Because this crisis is going to force a lot of people to confront that their way of living doesn't work. They're going to have to confront that they've been spending way too much money and saving not nearly enough. And then, as they try to rearrange that, they're going to confront the issue that they are perhaps chronic under-earners, or that they can't stop overspending. They can't stop debting. They can't stop online shopping. So perhaps then they may look for a spiritual solution, a 12-step solution. That I think fundamentally a lot of people are going to need a way of life that works. And then what about this article in the New York Times about how Americans are already too diseased to go back to work right now? Like 2/3 of Americans are fat, right? 2/3 of Americans are fat. All right. And being fat makes you particularly vulnerable to the coronavirus. So this is an op-ed in the New York Times yesterday by David Ludwig and Richard Malley. They are physicians specializing in obesity and infectious disease. And right now, only about 20% of Americans are really fit to get out there. So 4 features of COVID-19 combined to create a perfect pandemic. It's highly contagious, more than the flu, but less than measles. It's new, so few people have immunity. It causes infection without symptoms in many people who can unknowingly infect others, and it can latch on to receptors in the lungs, causing pneumonia much more frequently, perhaps 10 times more than seasonal flu. But it's not just the elderly and the frail who are at significant risk of a life-threatening complication. Data from China suggests many chronic health problems increase the likelihood of a bad outcome, including cardiovascular disease, which affects half the adults in the United States. Diabetes affects 10%. In Italy, 99% of the fatalities were people with pre-existing medical problems. So how many millions of Americans can't stop themselves overeating? Right? How many millions of Americans are addicted to an unhealthy way of living? And on their own willpower, they can't overcome it. So people are going to seek, I think, to overcome a crisis like this, they're going to have to seek a power greater than themselves, the whole God thing. Maybe it's organized religion. Maybe it's a 12-step program. Maybe it's other transcendent sources of power to enable people to overcome challenges, problems, obstacles that they can't overcome on their own. If 2/3 of Americans are fat, then that suggests to me that they are perhaps addicted to eating too much, which the explanation that makes most sense to me is that people overeat. I've overeaten frequently to dispel anxiety, or you just feel kind of empty inside. You have a hole in your soul, and so you try to fill it up with food. Obesity-related metabolic conditions put the public at exceptional risk. More than 2 of 3 adults in America have high body weight. 42% have obesity, about the highest rate in the world. 42% of American adults are obese. 2 in 10 American children are obese. Maybe, wouldn't it be horrible if this pandemic ran through our population and took away all the fatties? Like, where would our world be without the fat people? Like, just imagine if you walk down the street and the only people you see are fit, good-looking people, because all the fatties have been taken to Jesus by the coronavirus. That would be so sad. That would be devastating. I mean, you now go around in public and there aren't unsightly fat people kind of bumming you out. There aren't fat people causing you a feeling of disgust, taking up too much room on public transport. That would be so sad if the coronavirus just cleansed us of all the fatties out there. A California study of the 2009 influenza pandemic, people with obesity were twice as likely to be hospitalized compared to the state population. Like, all these fatties, they put enormous burdens on our healthcare system. Excessive weight and the poor quality diet that causes it is strongly associated with insulin resistance, chronic inflammation, and other abnormalities that lower immunity to viral respiratory infection and predispose one to many complications. So risk of dying from influenza is significantly increased for people with severe obesity. Only 12% of Americans over age 20 are considered metabolically healthy, with optimal measures for waist circumference, blood sugar, blood pressure, and lipids, and not taking drugs to control these risk factors. Only 12% of Americans over age 20 are healthy. Wow. So maybe people will use this pandemic to get in shape, to change their life, to recognize that they have a problem, and to reach out for a power greater than themselves, to reach out for a system or a group. So I think getting health insurance in the form of a group where people have to agree to abide by certain guidelines. So no fatties, for example. People must stay in shape, must exercise, must hit certain benchmarks to be able to have access to this insurance. That would dramatically lower costs for people who are conducting themselves in a responsible way. Just praying that the coronavirus doesn't take away all our fat people. It'd just be so sad to walk down the street and not see any fatties. I mean, I know that my life would feel robbed of meaning and laughter and pleasure and happiness if all the fatties were taken away from us. So I don't know about you, but I'm on my knees every day praying for the fatties, praying that they stay healthy, that they manage to avoid the worst of the coronavirus. But maybe this coronavirus will force people to take a second look at how they are living their lives, realize that the process by which they are operating does not work. It is not sufficient to confront the problems that they are dealing with. So maybe we will see a return to religion, a return to 12-step programs, a return to some kind of transcendent power greater than themselves. Perhaps we'll see millions of Americans radically reorienting their habits. I remember when I went away to Australia from June 1984 to June 1985, I wasn't able to closely follow American sports. So even though when I came back, I went back to following American sports, it has not been with the same fervor that I had prior to that 1 year break. So tens of millions of Americans are not going to be able to follow sports for a significant time. And if they go back to it, I suspect it will be with diminished enthusiasm for many. Others will completely lose interest. Others will find more useful hobbies, more useful passions, more useful ways of living than paying close attention to sports. Because what does sports fanaticism represent? It essentially represents you have an unwanted life. You don't like yourself. You don't like your life. And so you distract yourself by identifying with this sports team. And so that distracts you from your own problems or your own issues. But now, during the corona crisis, people can no longer distract themselves. So maybe some people will confront themselves and say, hey, let's get to work. I fundamentally don't like myself. I fundamentally have no hobbies, and fundamentally other people don't like me. It's time for a radical reorganization. It's time for a radical house cleaning. I need to direct my life in new ways. That the ways that I have been going simply do not work. They are not sufficient to the challenges that are facing us. So for millions of Americans, this corona pandemic and the accompanying shutdown, I think, will serve as a very useful prompt to re-examine their lives and to seek out a way of life that works more effectively.
Of a war in which the standard measurement of power predicted the wrong outcome, and yours was much more accurate.
So the Arab-Israeli wars, for example, Israel had far fewer gross resources than a lot of its Arab enemies and had to fight coalitions of these Arab enemies. But because it was a much more efficient state, it actually had a preponderance of net resources going into these wars. In terms of great powers, you look at Britain fighting China in the Opium Wars. China had the largest GDP in the world, the largest military in the world in the 19th century, and just got totally demolished by Britain in the Opium Wars. The Japanese did the same thing to the Chinese later in the 19th century. Again, if you look at it in gross terms, it looked like China should be the more powerful country. But when you measure power in net terms, it becomes clear that Japan and Great Britain were much more powerful than China at the time.
In addition to the pattern of great power rivalry and the outcome of wars, is there other important historical evidence that supports your argument?
Okay, that's Professor Michael Beckley, but I want to go to Tucker Carlson, highlight from his show last night here.
And speaking of the Chinese government, on February 6, scientists from the South China University of Technology uploaded a paper on the origins of coronavirus. Where did it come from? Well, this offers some clue. At the time, the official death toll in China from the coronavirus was 564. The paper made a number of notable observations and claims that are worth knowing about, and that's why we're telling you. We want to be clear that we're not endorsing any of these conclusions. We haven't independently confirmed them. We can't. But you should keep in mind as you hear this that these findings come from Chinese scientists who work for a university that is controlled by the Chinese government. So whatever else they are, the views you're about to hear are probably not racist anti-Chinese propaganda. Here's what the paper says. First, the scientists confirm what scientists around the world have said they believe. The virus most likely came from an animal known as the intermediate horseshoe bat. Here's the striking thing. There are no known colonies of this bat within 900 kilometers of Wuhan, nor is there any evidence that they were sold in the Wuhan wet market, despite many claims in the American media to the contrary, including on this show, by the way. Last night we did a segment on wet markets, the one in Wuhan included, and suggested that this bat was sold there. But let's be clear. The only actual analysis of that question that we're aware of is in this paper. These scientists interviewed almost 60 people, 59 of them, who frequented the Wuhan wet market. They confirmed there were no horseshoe bats for sale there, period. So that raises the question, where did the virus-carrying bats come from? And the paper says this, quote, "We screened the area around the market and identified 2 laboratories conducting research on bat coronavirus. Within a few hundred yards of the wet market was something called the Wuhan Center for Disease Control and Prevention. According to public reports, the center used intermediate horseshoe bats for research. Then about 7 miles away was another facility. This one was called the Wuhan Institute of Virology. The Virology Institute also conducted research on intermediate horseshoe bats, the ones that were not sold at the wet market. South China University scientists concluded that the coronavirus pandemic, the one that people are dying from here, likely came from one of these 2 government labs in Wuhan. They noticed that a scientist at the Wuhan Center for Disease Control and Prevention had been exposed to the blood and urine of horseshoe bats. They also suggested that infected tissue samples from research animals may have wound up in the Wuhan wet market. And they ended the paper this way, quote, "The killer coronavirus probably originated from a laboratory in Wuhan. Safety levels may need to be reinforced in high-risk biohazardous laboratories. Regulations may be taken to relocate these laboratories far away from city centers and other densely populated places." End quote. How's that for interesting? Now, this paper has been online for nearly 2 months, and so far it has been virtually ignored in this country. Almost nobody in American journalism has dared to write about it. The few who have were immediately attacked as dangerous conspiracy theorists. Instead of assessing what seemed like the rational conclusions presented in the Chinese paper, there was a spate of American news stories and academic research designed to show that the coronavirus absolutely could not have been engineered in a Chinese lab. They sounded supremely confident of that. But do they really know it? And the answer is no, they don't. As a factual matter, it is impossible for Western scientists to settle the question either way. So instead of doing that or admitting that, they amped up the rhetoric, hoping that you wouldn't notice the difference. A post on the National Institutes of Health website, written by NIH Director Francis Collins himself, dismisses any such speculation as, quote, outrageous. Keep in mind, NIH is supposed to be keeping you safe from diseases like this one, not running political interference for hostile foreign governments. This is how they're spending their time as Americans die in the middle of a global pandemic. And still, no one addressed the substance of the claims. The South China University paper concludes that the virus probably escaped accidentally from a lab in Wuhan. It said not one word about bioweapons. Yet the NIH and USA Today and countless other outlets have devoted thousands of words to scolding you for thinking the virus may have been a form of biological warfare. Notice that's a totally different claim than the one made in the paper. And that's not accidental. One of the surest signs that people are lying to you is when they answer questions you didn't ask. And that's exactly what the professional class is doing with this story. And they're doing it on many fronts. They're lying to you. They're claiming to know things they don't know. They're dismissing the obvious as impossible. They're blaming you for their failures. And the media are helping them do it. The stakes are too high to let them continue this way. So no matter what, stay skeptical as you assess the world. Remain rational. Gather your own evidence and come to your own conclusions. You shouldn't have to do that. You ought to be able to trust the people in charge. But you can't. So at this point...
Wow,
well, last
Carlson.
night we showed you the video, and it was nauseating, of senior World Health Organization official Bruce Alward, a Canadian, refusing to answer questions about Taiwan and how it was dealing with coronavirus. In fact, Alward wouldn't even acknowledge the question or acknowledge the existence of Taiwan. It was repulsive, but it wasn't surprising. Alward was just following directions from the very top. Tedros Adhanom, he's the Director General of the World Health Organization, got his job with Chinese support after he covered up cholera outbreaks in his home country, a perfect man to lead the World Health Organization. And he has subsequently set the standard for corruption there. Here he is in January. Watch this.
The Chinese government is to be congratulated for the extraordinary measures it has taken to contain the outbreak. The speed with which China detected the outbreak, isolated the virus, sequenced the genome, and shared it with WHO and the world are very impressive and beyond words. China is actually setting a new standard for outbreak response, and it's not an exaggeration.
That's the top public health official in the world, and everything you just heard him say there was a lie. A recent 60 Minutes piece from Australia, a piece our media are not playing, shows just how deep the lies go. In fact, there was nothing speedy about how China detected the outbreak and then warned the world. Indeed, they did the exact opposite.
From the very beginning, throughout December, it was spreading, and we now know it was spreading human to human. But the official line of the Chinese government was that this was all related to an animal market, and once they closed the market, it would all go away.
Did they know differently at that time?
Absolutely. Because they were seeing cases coming into the hospitals that had nothing whatsoever to do with that animal market.
So the World Health Organization's leadership tells you that China, quote, set the standard for the outbreak to the response. Apparently that standard includes disappearing doctors who tell the truth about it.
As China now tries to rewrite history and claim it was transparent all along, a final nail in the coffin of their lie. Just 2 weeks ago, the head of emergency at Wuhan Central Hospital, Dr. Ai Fen, also went public, saying authorities had stopped her and her colleagues from warning the world. She has now disappeared, whereabouts unknown.
Again, why is it left to Australian media to produce a piece like this? The truth is, as 60 Minutes Australia explains, instead of worrying about these developments, in early February, the director of the World Health Organization was still lecturing the public that using terms like Wuhan virus was racist.
Having a name matters to prevent the use of other names that can be inaccurate or stigmatizing.
You might think that a World Health Organization, a group that got 58 million of your tax dollars last year, might care that a government arrests doctors and lies about deadly new diseases, but no. Like so many other organizations, they are lapdogs for the powerful, and that means their real job is sucking up to the Chinese government.
I don't know why people don't find the head of the World Health Organization so, why they find him lacking in credibility. I just take a look at him. He seems like the most credible bloke in the world. He seems like the most qualified person in the world to be leading the global response to the Wuhan virus. I just don't get why people have any questions or doubts about this guy. He seems obviously credible to me. But here's more from Tucker.
The United States is by far the world's top funder of the World Health Organization. We give the organization about $58 million every year. That's double what any other country donates for some reason. But for the organization's leaders, there's only one country that matters, and it's not us, it's China. Right now, Taiwan is battling coronavirus, but they are denied membership in the World Health Organization. They can't even have observer status. Why is that? People are dying, but the World Health Organization refuses to protect them. Why do you think that is? Because China objects to anyone acknowledging that Taiwan is a nation. From the beginning, World Health Organization officials have praised China's response to coronavirus. They've repeated the country's lies as fact to the rest of the world. Initially, China claimed that the coronavirus could not be transmitted from person to person, even though doctors in Wuhan knew otherwise, and it was obviously untrue. The World Health Organization, though, told that lie to the world, and that hindered global preparation to contain the virus. They made it worse, not better. And then the World Health Organization praised China for its transparency, a cruel joke. As those lies have been exposed, the World Health Organization's subservience to their masters in Beijing has only become more obvious, more naked. On Saturday, a Hong Kong television station aired an interview with the World Health Organization assistant director called Bruce Aylward. He's a Canadian. We want to show you this whole thing. We hope you'll watch carefully because it tells you everything about where this world is going and why you should be really nervous about the government of China. Watch this.
Would the WHO consider Taiwan's membership? Hello?
I'm sorry, I can't hear you. I couldn't hear your question.
Okay, yeah. Let me repeat the question.
No, that's okay. Let's move to another one then.
Right, because I'm actually curious on talking about Taiwan as well, on Taiwan's case.
We decided to give Dr. Aylward another call to follow up.
And I just want to see if you can comment a bit on how Taiwan has done so far in terms of containing the virus.
Well, we've already talked about China, and when you look across all the different areas of China, they've actually all done quite a good job. So with that, I'd like to thank you very much for inviting us to participate, and good luck as you go forward with the battle in Hong Kong.
In the middle of a global pandemic, they're refusing to help a country because China told them not to. And then the World Health Organization, which represents all of us, which we pay for more than any other country, is boldly, without shame, repeating Chinese government propaganda. The man you just saw, Bruce Aylward, by the way, wasn't just caught in a bad moment over Skype. Here's another clip of him sucking up to the government of China.
To the people of Wuhan, it is recognized that the world's in your debt, and when this disease finishes, hopefully we'll have a chance to thank the people of Wuhan for the role that they've played in it.
It's beyond disgusting. It's scary. Gordon Chang is the author of The Coming Collapse of China, and he joins us tonight. Gordon, you've been on this topic for such a long time. Does it surprise you that the World Health Organization, which normal people, me, look at and think, they're keeping the world safe from pandemics, that they're actually acting as a spokesman for the government of China? Does that surprise you?
Well, this has been going on for some time, Tucker, and there have been a number of other things that we've got to be concerned about. So it's not just Bruce Aylward, who, by the way, said that he had absolutely no reason to question China's numbers. It's also Dr. Tedros, who's the director general, in other words, the #1 guy. In late January, Tedros gave an interview to China's state media saying that Beijing's response was admirable, should be emulated by the rest of the world. And then he said it all showed the superiority of China's socialist system. Well, China has a totalitarian system, and really what he was doing was attacking democracy on behalf of Beijing. So this is really despicable across the board.
I mean, this really matters. This isn't like NBA players kowtowing to the Chinese government. We're in the middle of a pandemic. This is the World Health Organization. Why is nobody... Where is Bill Gates, who's the single largest individual funder? Why isn't he saying anything? Why isn't Google saying anything? Why aren't our leaders saying anything about this?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. This is dangerous because for the last 10 days of January and for the first 10, 15 days of February, the World Health Organization was parroting Beijing's line that no country should enact travel restrictions on China. And that's because there were no travel restrictions, or very few of them, the United States being an exception. what happened was this virus spread even farther around China's borders. So what the WHO has done was it actually helped spread the coronavirus around the world, and it did it on behalf of Beijing.
It's just beyond belief. It's hard to believe those words are true, but they are true.
And so YouTube and Twitter and big tech, they essentially only allow you to transmit opinions that are in line with the World Health Organization on coronavirus. And the World Health Organization essentially just kowtows to whatever the Chinese Communist Party says. So big tech, YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, they are all essentially enforcing the Chinese Communist Party's line on reactions to the coronavirus. And if you don't follow by that line, what happens to you is what's happened to me. I get shadow banned. So I have about a third of my normal audience because people who subscribe to this channel, YouTube will not give them notifications. YouTube will not have my videos show up in their YouTube feeds. YouTube is doing everything it can to suppress this channel short of completely deleting it, because I don't automatically follow the Chinese Communist Party, because I do not automatically follow the edicts of the World Health Organization, which simply seems to just say whatever the Chinese Communist Party tells it to say. So there's a price for that. I remember in the run-up to the 2016 election, Google removed my website, lukeford.net, from its search results for the 3 months prior to the November 4 election. And there are services you can buy that will check out why Google has removed you from its listings and restore you to Google's good graces. So I hired some service for like $100. They did an investigation. They said there's absolutely no reason why Google should be banning you from its search results. But after the election, then Google just restored lukeford.net. But for the 3 months prior to the election, they removed lukeford.net from search results. When people wanted to search about Hillary's health, Google would redirect them to articles that would dismiss any concerns about Hillary's health. Google's been playing games for years and years on search results to try to shape things in a liberal way. For example, it would not auto-complete Patrick Buchanan's name. So all these little tricks that Google's been doing. So what's going on with Twitter right now? All right, so just trying to look up information on Twitter. This professor, Zeynep Tufekci, put in to Twitter, Wuhan misunderstanding, Wall Street Journal, and this is what Twitter does. To make sure you get the best information, resources are available from the CDC. Okay, the CDC was telling people not to wear masks. They're looking for a Wall Street Journal article on one aspect of Wuhan quarantine, but Twitter won't even let me search. Just directs me to the CDC. What happened if Twitter censored all searches about masks and directed us to the CDC? This isn't know the facts. I can't even search Wuhan. So this is what big tech is doing. They seem to essentially be carrying out the directives of the Chinese Communist Party. That's where we're at in the United States of America. Right now, the Chinese Communist Party essentially decides the limits on what we're allowed to say publicly. The big tech, YouTube, Twitter, Facebook, essentially turned over the parameters of acceptable discussion to China's Communist Party. How do you feel about that? Do you think China's Communist Party really is the best group for determining what we in America get to talk about? Well, big tech thinks that that's just peachy. China's Communist Party, they're really on top of things. Here's the 60 Minutes Australia piece.
Wuhan, China, a sprawling city of 11 million people. It was here that coronavirus, our invisible, brutal enemy, was born, festering at least a month and a half before the world was told.
I don't think there's any dispute at all in terms of the scientific record that this virus made its original jump to the first human sometime in mid-November of last year.
Emerging diseases expert Laurie Garrett has been eyewitness to more than 30 frightening disease outbreaks, including Ebola and SARS. Like most New Yorkers, she's now restricted to her apartment in Manhattan, sheltering from coronavirus.
That's about 12.5 million human beings. So we're a little bit bigger than Wuhan. And I feel like that's what I'm looking at.
So China has unleashed a massive biological weapon on the world that will kill tens of thousands, if not millions of people, whether they release this intentionally or unintentionally or simply... I think they probably did it unintentionally. I think it's probably carelessness and shoddiness. But China is going to be responsible for trillions of dollars of damage, for millions of businesses shutting down permanently, massive disruption to the lives of billions of people. Okay, this is because of China, and China's released all sorts of horrible diseases in the past that have infected people all around the world and caused massive disruption to lives. And America's big tech industry decides that the Chinese Communist Party is the best organization for deciding what we get to talk about on social media.
America's Wuhan.
The epicenter of the coronavirus in the States at the moment.
I don't know if you hear it right now, but I hear 4 sirens right now outside. These are all ambulances. There goes another one.
Wuhan, mid-November, and first cases of a strange new flu start surfacing. From early December, Chinese authorities say the new virus has arisen from a local live fish and animal market. They're adamant it's not SARS or anything like it. Anyone who suggests otherwise is suppressed. On New Year's Eve, an official announcement. The closure of the wet market has stopped the spread of the disease, and there is no evidence of human-to-human infection of the virus. But as you'll see, that was not true.
From the very...
So, Bruce Aylward, remember that doctor who wouldn't even talk about Taiwan? March 4, he told the New York Times that there was little evidence the coronavirus was being spread by asymptomatic carriers. This is March 4. So this guy's a lead official with the World Health Organization. He tells the New York Times, March 4. There's no evidence. We're seeing only the tip of a grand iceberg, with 9/10 of it made up of hidden zombies shedding virus. What we're seeing is a pyramid. Most of it is above ground. That's what he told the New York Times, March 4. And this guy's a leader with the World Health Organization. He's a favorite of the Chinese Communist Party, leading figure in the Chinese Communist Party's propaganda machine. He's always fawning over the communist regime's handling the coronavirus pandemic. Just disgusting. And social media, America's big tech, will censor any criticism of this guy. They will mute you. They will force you to delete posts. They will shadow ban you. He is to be above criticism. The World Health Organization is to be above criticism. China's Communist Party must be above criticism.
At the beginning, throughout December, it was spreading, and we now know it was spreading human to human. But the official line of the Chinese government was that this was all related to an animal market, and once they closed the market, it would all go away.
Did they know differently at that time?
Absolutely. Because they were seeing cases coming into the hospitals that had nothing whatsoever to do with that animal market.
A group of senior doctors at Wuhan Central Hospital was becoming more and more terrified by the cases they were seeing. Chief amongst them was Dr. Li Wenliang, the whistleblower who first tried to warn the world.
I'm sure history will record Li Wenliang as the hero of this entire pandemic. He recognized that he was seeing people with a bizarre form of pneumonia. He got into a chat room and said, I think this looks SARS-like. So he posted this. That triggered every alarm in the system. So all 8 of the physicians, including Li Wenliang, were brought before the equivalent of a hospital tribunal and compelled to sign statements declaring themselves liars and that rumor mongers. And they were officially chastised, but they continued working, treating patients. And of course, we all know Li Wenliang died as a result of COVID at the age of 34.
They are responsible for one of the worst global pandemics ever known to mankind. And it's happening right now, and it's destroying people. It's destroying lives, and it's destroying our economy.
US Congressman Michael McCall is the most senior Republican on the Foreign Affairs Committee and is former chairman of Homeland Security. He accuses China of deliberately hiding the truth.
Well, I've described it previously as the worst cover-up in human history. I think it was criminal.
So if big tech had the power that they have with social media today, back in 2002, 2003, they would have probably banned you or shadow banned you from any suggestions that Iraq did not have weapons of mass destruction. Any dissent from the march to war against Iraq, I assume that America's big tech would have acted similarly, banned people who try to make that point.
What they did.
But this isn't just a war between the US and China. Congressman McCall points to a respected independent newspaper based in Beijing, which uncovered shocking behaviour by Chinese government officials. It reported that testing labs that had cracked the code and identified the mystery flu as a new coronavirus strain were ordered to hand over or destroy their samples. They were not allowed to release their findings. When they're getting laboratories to actually destroy samples, I mean, the culpability of that is mind-boggling, isn't it?
It is. The Chinese Communist Party perpetrating this, going in, destroying samples, trying to cover this up. And the fact that 95% of this could have been stopped had we taken it seriously at the beginning and the World Health Organization been properly notified, that they just could have contained and stopped this from happening.
But that chance was lost over a 2-week period. On January 7, a week after they identified the flu as a new coronavirus strain, Chinese officials informed the World Health Organization. But they advised that with just over 40 cases, they had it in hand and that it couldn't be transmitted from person to person.
We believe that they can also contain it.
The truth is, the epidemic was doubling in size weekly, and China knew it was being spread by human contact. It's just the rest of the world was kept in the dark.
Inside Wuhan, the people knew what was going on. Everybody was seeing the bodies being pulled out of apartments and the ailing just completely out of it on gurneys being carried off to mysterious hospitals all over the place.
From January 7, the next 12 days are critical as China's Great Lie continues alongside its inaction. Had China acted immediately instead of covering up, it's estimated that 95% of the eventual pandemic could have been prevented, but it didn't. It's not until January 20 that China reveals the real rate of infection. Instead of a total 40 cases, they're now reporting more than 400 a day. And they finally admit what they've hidden for weeks. The deadly virus is contagious between humans.
By then, catastrophe is looming, and January 25 is the official lunar holiday, the biggest holiday in all of China, arguably the single biggest holiday on Earth, because more human beings move about within China in anticipation of the lunar holiday than any other occasion of internal movement anywhere in the world.
During January, President Xi Jinping was well aware of how deadly the situation was. Yet he made a decision that would ultimately condemn the world. He allowed 5 million people to leave the epicentre of the virus, to leave Wuhan without being screened for COVID-19, before he decided to impose a lockdown.
By the time they finally do that, we have a catastrophe on our hands. It's already spread to Singapore, to South Korea, to Japan. We're in the beginnings of the pandemic.
As China now tries to rewrite history and claim it was transparent all along, a final nail in the coffin of their lie. Just 2 weeks ago, the head of emergency at Wuhan Central Hospital, Dr. Ai Fen, also went public, saying authorities had stopped her and her colleagues from warning the world. She has now disappeared, whereabouts unknown. How squarely do you put the blame at the feet of that regime?
I'm arguing that this entire pandemic rests at the feet of two people, Xi Jinping and Donald Trump, the two most powerful men on earth, of the two most powerful and wealthy nations on earth, both of whom sought in their own ways to downplay the significance of the emergence of COVID-19. And really, both of them, I think, are to blame for allowing this to unfold in this horrible form.
China has been working very hard to contain the coronavirus. The United States greatly appreciates their efforts and transparency. It will all work out well, in particular on behalf of the American people. I want to thank President Xi.
Incredibly, Donald Trump's gratitude and glowing endorsement of President Xi Jinping came after his own intelligence agencies had warned him China wasn't being open about an impending global outbreak of the virus.
We have it totally under control.
Go back to bed.
One person coming in from China, and we have it under control. It's going to be just fine.
Well, I've been working on this problem of emerging pandemics and epidemic threats almost my whole adult life.
Or is everything just Ebola?
And of course, I was one of the 3 scientific advisors for the movie Contagion. We really spent a lot of time thinking this through. And yet, now that it's really here, this is so far beyond what anybody ever imagined. I mean, we never imagined the entire world economy collapsing.
What did they die of, the 3?
Reports are vague. Seizures, comas.
We've reached out to the WHO, see what they know.
So in your imaginings, is your government responding the way you imagined it would? Is it responding the way it should?
I'm sorry. We made a big mistake with that movie because we never imagined an incompetent American government. So in all of our plotting, government was actually the hero. It was intervening to save the people. And that's just not the way it's worked out. We've now had the president say openly on more than one occasion that he's weighing in the balance the future of the stock market against dead bodies in this country.
For Donald Trump not to take this more seriously sooner, what is the cost to your nation and your people?
Well, I think it caught some by surprise, how quickly it spread and how fast it did.
Okay, so what about all the armchair quarterbacks who say that they saw this coming all along? But first, here's Bill.
Go back to bed, America. Your government has figured out how it all transpired. Go back to bed, America. Your government is in control again. Here's American gladiators. Watch this. Shut up. Go back to bed, America. Here's American gladiators. Here is 56 channels of it. Watch these pituitary retards bang their fucking skulls together and congratulate you on living in the land of freedom. Here you go, America. You are free to do as we tell you. You are free to do as we tell you. Oh, good. Honey, I heard on the news that they figured out that the gun, what happened is that there is an echo and that Kennedy was asking Jackie what it was, and that's why his head flew up. Honey, what time's Gladiators on? Are we?
Okay, Bill Hicks. Okay, what about all the armchair quarterbacks trying to rewrite history on the
Armchair
coronavirus?
quarterbacks try to rewrite history on coronavirus, National Review. COVID-19 caught lots of people in America by surprise. We shouldn't pretend otherwise for cynical political game. This morning, MSNBC's Joe Scarborough claimed that, unlike the Trump administration, everybody saw this coming in early January. If Scarborough knew that a deadly, Once-in-a-century pandemic was about to descend on the nation in early January. I assume he considers himself part of everyone. Why on God's earth didn't he warn his susceptible viewers that they should begin social distancing? Why didn't his producers book a single expert who could beseech his viewers to start wearing masks, to shutter their non-essential businesses, and to avoid church and sporting events? Why didn't he mention coronavirus at all? Even in late January, nearly a full month after everyone knew, Scarborough's show was dominated by the Donald Trump impeachment trial. As far as I can tell, in the entire month of January, Morning Joe didn't reference the coronavirus once to his 2.6 million followers on Twitter. Imagine the thousands of lives Scarborough could have saved if he had only shared his insight. Does everyone include the World Health Organization, which claimed in a January 14 tweet, reflecting earlier findings, that preliminary investigations into Chinese authorities found no clear evidence of human-to-human transmission of the novel coronavirus? Does everyone include the Chinese government, whose propaganda Scarborough shares as reliable data? Because it was China's downplaying and lying about coronavirus that ensured its spread around the world. The blood is on their hands, not on the hands of your least favorite American politicians. In early March, when reporters were fixated on a vacuous debate over the political correctness of affixing China to the virus's name, researchers at the University of Southampton released a study indicating that 95% of COVID-19 cases would have been prevented around the world if the communist regime had acted 3 weeks earlier. If China had intervened just 1 week earlier, there would have been an 66% mitigation, while 2 weeks would have led to 86% fewer cases. Scarborough, like most of us, was busy talking about the impeachment trial in early January. And that's exactly the topic we should have been focusing on. We had no business expecting our elected officials or our media outlets to obsess over every outbreak in China. No doubt I'm older than many of you, but I can recall warnings about perhaps a dozen potentially dangerous epidemic breakouts around the world, and none of them ever materialized in a legitimately scary way for us. It's human nature to assume similar outcomes. And if China had acted like a first world nation, coronavirus would have been contained. Even if Scarborough had warned us, what would the public have done differently in early January, before a single confirmed case in the United States? When Trump did something in late January and restricted travel to China, I don't recall a single mainstream pundit applauding him for taking the virus seriously. In fact, the opposite happened. And even if we had listened to the scientists, the United States wouldn't have been able to avert the coronavirus. Expert predictions were all over the place, and very few researchers or scientists came close to calling the spread correctly. But now we're going to act as if politicians were negligent for failing to try to lock down the entire economy in early January? In mid-March, you could hardly get people off beach in Florida, but you think the American public was going to consent to deep freeze the economy and shut down the NFL in January? To say such things is just armchair quarterbacking of the most cynical kind.
Okay, let's move over here to an uplifting song from the middle of the pandemic.
I'm sitting here in isolation, waiting for the vaccination. Ooh. Stock market's down, the stores are closed, retirement plans are surely hosed, toilet paper's running low, it's a good thing I don't have to go. We're all homebound, how long will we still be homebound? Home, keeping social distance, home, without friends' assistance, home, at government's insistence, stuck in our houses. I'm getting used to sleeping late, should clean the house, but it can wait. Ooh. I try to work from my PC, but soon the fridge is calling me. I eat some snacks, turn on TV. Without Netflix, what would life be? We're all homebound. How long will we still be homebound? Home, till the virus dies out. Home, till the groceries run out. Home, till the wine's all drunk. We're stuck in our houses. So please just stay in your own space. Don't shave so you don't touch your face. Ooh. Wash your hands until they're raw for 20 seconds. That's the law. The curve will flatten. We'll have seen the ending to COVID-19. We're all homebound. How long will we still be homebound? coronavirus dies out. Home till the groceries run out. Home till the wine's all drunk. And we have defeated coronavirus.
That is pretty good. I like that. Okay, here's an adaptation of Les Mis.
Can we just have him out? Stop! Why are you hitting me? I haven't done anything.
Yeah, you're being loud.
She just hit me all day. That's all she's done.
No, I
all
did
day.
that.
No, all you did was
He's a bully.
One day more, another day, another destiny. Shopping for online delivery. I'm trying to get a lead to find there's nothing till September time. One day I had the football match today. How can I play when we are partying? One day more, our grandparents are miles away. They can't work Skype, we're broken hearted.
One more day alone, my phone.
Will we ever meet again?
One more sadly, really blurry.
I am bored of being with you.
Not until the day is blue.
So we swear until we bloom.
But we never let me shine.
One more day upon life. Do we get a change of clothes? Teachers fill up Google Classroom. Brothers, there are exams for morning. Do I change my underwear? And we're sharing a bathroom. Time is now, the day is here. One day more.
One more day's home education. Let's just let them run amok. We're not ready for these schoolboys, cause they just don't give a fuck.
What the bloody thing? See how mummy sigh? Clapping for the NHS would make them cry. Here's a little walk, there's a little ride. Such a little bummer when we're stuck inside.
What they do a new beginning.
It's a respirator fan.
Everyone will be vaccinated.
That's a little bit sexy.
New world to be winning.
There's a new world to be won.
Do you hear the people sing?
It's us here, I eat with you. One day more, another rise, another way. One day more.
Tomorrow is another day. Tomorrow we'll discover what Tesco Online has got in store. One more door. One more day. One day more.
Okay, that was pretty good. So there are some good things coming out of this shutdown. All right, let's have a look here. Kerry Howley tweets, my son just asked me if when I was little I had to stay inside for COVIDs 1 through 18. That's pretty good. And Ramsey Poor tweets, you should get a socially isolated button, sort of like those I voted buttons. Alice Teller tweets, China lied, who cares? My own government told me masks don't work and racism was the worst we had to fear with friends like that. And PD Mangan tweets, most New York COVID deaths had underlying conditions. And Carlos Mariah, MD, tweets, very likely the ones with no underlying conditions do have them, simply not being diagnosed and or have a poor diet. The number of truly healthy people is very small. So the Daily Mail in the United Kingdom is always posting these stories about people with no underlying conditions have been dying from coronavirus, but then when you see the pictures they're always like morbidly obese and very sickly looking. Okay, Bloomberg, confirmed coronavirus cases is an almost meaningless metric. We need more complete coordinated data to know when it's safe to reopen the U.S. economy. It doesn't matter. The United States surpassed China this week in reported COVID-19 cases because those numbers don't tell us how many people actually became infected in either country, nor do they tell us how fast the disease is spreading, since only a tiny portion of the population has been tested. We need complete data. The population of 1.5 billion, China's 80,000 cases look like a rounding error. India's claim of just 754 cases reflects a severe lack of testing. What should we be watching instead? Hospitalizations. So the rate of increase in hospitalizations could reflect the growth of COVID-19. Measuring death rates can eventually track the speed with which COVID-19 is spreading, but there's a lag of 3 weeks between infection and death. So it takes between 11 to 14 days for someone to get sick enough to show up to the hospital. And then if they're going to die, they'll usually die about a week later. The death rates around 1% have been tossed around. We just don't know enough. Some useful data could easily be collected at testing sites. Health departments should tally not just positives, but total tests. But that information isn't apparently being collected. Okay, how do we measure the power of nations? Measuring what matters. This is Professor Michael Beckley.
So I think the Cold War is one of those great power rivalries I take the reader through. And the Soviet Union outpaced the United States by most measures of gross resources. So industrial production, military spending, R&D spending, troops, nuclear weapons, scientists and engineers, but it still lost the Cold War in large part because the United States was able to minimize costs and therefore actually had much greater net resources and was able to outlast the Soviet Union during the Cold War.
Well, it's interesting that the historical evidence seems to support your basic argument that we need to look at this net measurement of power. But what does it say? What does your method say about the current balance of world power?
It shows that the United States actually has a much bigger economic and military lead over other countries than most people think, and the trends are mostly in America's favor. And to me, this suggests that unipolarity, this situation where the United States is the world's sole superpower, is on pace to last for decades, probably for the rest of our lifetimes. It's going to long be a unipolar world.
Well, there are a lot of people who look at the rise of China and say that the unipolar era was just a moment and it's over. How does your analysis change the way we look at Chinese power?
My method drastically changes how we view China as a great power. So I'll give you a couple examples. In the economic sphere, China by some measures has the world's largest economy. That's certainly true, but what a lot of people miss is China also leads the world in things like debt and capital flight and loss-making companies and useless infrastructure. Chinese businesses use twice the amount of capital and 5 times the labor to produce the same amount of wealth as the average American firm. And the Chinese government has to spend hundreds of billions of dollars more than the United States every year to provide services and provide security for its huge population. So when you subtract out a lot of those costs, I find that the U.S. has roughly 4 to 5 times the amount of aggregate wealth that China has, even though China's overall GDP is, by some measures, has already overtaken that of the U.S. It's the same picture in the military sphere. So China's military budget has been rising rapidly over the last 20 to 30 years. That's certainly true. On the other hand, China is surrounded by 19 hostile countries.
So January 15 was the date that the first coronavirus patient entered the United States. So what were the Democrats doing on January 15? What was keeping them occupied? What was the focus of their attention? Well, they were carrying articles of impeachment over to the United States Senate. So January 15th, first patient carrying the Chinese coronavirus returns to the United States from Wuhan, Charlie Kirk tweets. And this is what the Democrats in Congress were doing. Remind me again, who was fiddling while people died? Nancy Pelosi. Whoops. I don't want that one. I want this one.
It also has much higher levels of internal unrest than the United States. And as a result, China has to maintain this mass army on guard at home. And roughly 35% of its military budget and half of its active duty force are essentially performing internal security and border defense missions. The U.S., on the other hand, can project almost all of its military power abroad because it's surrounded by friends in fish, Canada, Mexico, two huge oceans. The U.S. and has much lower rates of internal instability. So again, looking in net terms rather than gross terms paints a radically different picture, both in the economic sphere and in the military sphere.
So the way you would propose to measure power leads to very different conclusions about the current global distribution of power and the apparent rise of China. What are the implications for U.S. policy?
I think the main implication is, the U.S. has a big lead and the trends look like they're going mostly in its favor. So don't screw it up. I don't think the U.S. needs to do anything drastic to keep potential rivals like, say, China or Russia in check. It certainly needs to confront those rivals in certain areas, but it doesn't need to gear up for a new Cold War, as some people are currently advocating. So to me, the biggest threat to American primacy is not the rise of a pure competitor. Rather, it's some gross overreaction based on inaccurate assessments of the balance of power that cause the U.S. to overextend itself abroad and to underinvest economically here at home. So avoiding those outcomes requires accurate assessments of power, and that's what I tried to provide in the article.
Well, you've taken on an incredibly important topic, come up with some new ideas, and reached some conclusions.
Okay, here's what's going on in Twitter. Study finds that the coming economic crisis could lead to 831,000 suicides, 4 times the number of estimated coronavirus deaths. Interesting. Israel's Prime Minister Bibi Netanyahu says Israel will restrict movement to and from ultra-Orthodox coronavirus hotspot and calls on the public to wear face masks. Didn't you get the memo from the CDC and the WHO that face masks don't do any good? And Fiery Cushman, Associate Professor of Psychology at Harvard University, tweets, "Is this the next frontier in the replication crisis? New multi-lab effort in Nature shows that only 43% of recipes in Mastering the Art of French Cooking can be reproduced." Okay, let's try out Strike and Mike.
This is why America is going to be fully discredited when this is all over. America is really showing how inefficient and shitty our fucking system is.
Wow. I mean, this is so emblematic of much of the alt-right. They just really hate the United States of America in a deranged, unhinged way.
I saw conservatives, again, more cope-servatism. Fucking going out there when the Chinese announced that they were going to meet the Italian demand for ventilators, and the conservatives were like, oh yeah, right, yeah, like you're going to be able to make that many ventilators in that short period of time. Well, the Chinese planners simply put all their factories on alert and put 24/7 shifts in these factories. They're open 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and they're meeting the demand. They're building the ventilators. Meanwhile, Donald Trump is out there tweeting, General Motors said they could build 60,000
He actually ordered
very
them
soon.
to do it.
He finally ordered them to do it.
It's like, why not? Why did
you do it earlier?
This is the other thing. When we understand that governments have powers like that, and the only thing keeping them from exercising it is like, frankly, stupid ideology. Well, there's other things too, but generally speaking, if the people themselves don't believe, the way they sell it to you is with ideology. They have their own plutocratic reasons, right?
Right.
But the way they sell it to you, the way they make it credible to you, is dumb ideology. So finally Donald Trump just said, and fucking hell, Trump is making fucking Cuomo look good. Cuomo goes out there and he's like, oh, we need 40,000 ventilators in the state of New York. How do you...
Cuomo, these guys embody that part of the alt-right that's just incredibly conformist. So they all decide at one time that they love Trump, and then they all decide now that they hate Trump, and now they've all decided that they love China and that they hate America, and they're all lockstep and in line with each other on this.
You do that. I'm trying to do Jackie. I can't do Kumo. Whatever.
Did you hear
it's Cuomo, not Kumo.
It was news just before this started. His brother has coronavirus. The CNN anchor.
Oh wow. That's. I'm gonna do him. I'll do him. That sucks. Let's move on. Right?
But well, you know what's funny? You're totally right. What they're really mad about right now in the West is, for years we've heard, it's impossible to close the borders. It's impossible to stop this or that. It's impossible to intervene in the economy. It's impossible to afford a check for every American during a recession. And now we see that actually, no, governments can do it. Look at how the governments of Europe were able to shut down, struggling with immigration. What are we going to do with all these immigrants? How the fuck were they able to shut down the border so quickly in Europe? Okay?
And then at the same time, there's this realignment as well where, Italy is importing tons and tons of medical supplies from China. Ireland had a massive shipment of medical supplies the other day. France now had to order masks from China. It's waiting on them. Serbia was hoping for aid from the EU, and the EU basically told them to go fuck themselves. And now they've turned
yes.
Yeah, now they've turned to China, and that's a big realignment because for years, the politicians in Serbia have been trying to bring them closer to the EU, and this has kind of pushed the project back by decades. And I mean, look at Orban suspending democracy in Hungary. But again, it's the joys of the free market system. But where are all these countries turning to now when they need supplies and when they need real aid? It's this realignment to China.
Yeah, NATO and Europe are useless.
Wow, these guys hate the free market. They hate capitalism. They hate, I guess, Western individualism. They hate the United States of America. That sounds like a really powerful platform for growing their movement in the United States. They love communist China.
Imagine you buy. You guys should fucking read about this. The Italians bought hundreds of thousands of surgical masks or whatever N95 masks from Turkey.
Yeah.
And
okay, it's just. I don't think that's worth playing. All right, let's go back to more conversations here with Michael Beckley. The myth of entangling alliances.
Hello, I'm Sean Lynn Jones. I'm the editor of International Security, a quarterly journal that's edited at the Belfer Center here at Harvard's Kennedy School. Today, I'm speaking to Michael Beckley, who's an assistant professor in the political science department at Tufts University. Mike is the author of an article called The Myth of Entangling Alliances, Reassessing the Risks of U.S. Defense Pacts. And his basic argument is the United States is unlikely to be dragged into war by its allies.
So here are excerpts from his previous essay, How Do We Measure Real Power? He gives examples from history, such as Britain versus China, 1839 to 1911. By standard indicators, China looked like a superpower in the 19th and early 20th centuries. It had the largest GDP and military in the world till the 1890s and the second largest GDP and military until the 1930s. During this time, however, China suffered a century of humiliation, which it lost significant territory, most of its sovereign rights, fighting at least a dozen wars on its home soil and losing every single one of them. Most important of these conflicts were the two opium wars with Britain. Centuries European merchants had traveled to China to swap silver for tea and silk. In the 19th century, however, British traders discovered that they could obtain better terms of trade by growing opium in India and selling it on the black market in China. Despite China's long-standing ban on opium, British dealers smuggled into China nearly 12 tons of the drug annually, enough to keep 3 million addicts high year-round. Now remember, these addicts are not being forced to take opium. They choose to take opium. This influx of narcotics eroded 20% of China's wealth from 1828 to 1836. To stem the opium epidemic, the Chinese government declared a war on drugs in 1839. Chinese officials began seizing opium from British merchants and dumping it into the sea. Britain responded by sailing 16 warships into Chinese waters, sinking China's navy. So kind of a turning point for me in understanding how the world works was watching this something like 80-part Colombia TV series on Pablo Escobar. And as I watched the series, I suddenly realized, wait, why should Colombians not give in to an opportunity to make a great deal of money selling a drug to an outgroup like Americans? Like, why should Colombians choose a a difficult life choose to live in poverty when they could live comfortably, even live affluently, if they simply create, manufacture, transport, and sell a product to outgroups? So one of the fundamental perspectives of this show is that we should not expect people, by and large, to care about outgroups. When it happens, when people behave responsibly, that's wonderful. But by and large, people don't care about outgroups. The exception comes from essentially Northern Europeans. Individualist cultures tend to regard the moral standard being universal and applying to everyone. But most peoples in the world belong to a collectivist culture where they make a strong distinction between the in-group and the out-group. So that's how the world works for most people. And so therefore, we cannot expect anything morally from people with regard to how they treat outgroups. So if you're in Mexico, Central America, or South America, and you have the opportunity to make money selling a product to an outgroup, why would you care that that product could harm them? I just realized that. Prior to that, I just thought, oh man, these people are all, they're just low, or they're just engaging in this, awful, immoral, highly destructive occupation. But then when I thought about it from their perspective, how could I tell someone who's just starving or someone who's struggling to get by that they shouldn't be able to pay for their own medical needs, pay to support their family, pay to live comfortably by making a product for outgroups? Now, I think it's wonderful when people decide not to engage in such destructive behavior. But as I watch these TV shows about the narcotics trade in desperately poor countries like Colombia and Mexico, then I gain much greater empathy for outgroups. So now it no longer surprises me that Britain in the 1830s and 1840s was shipping 12 tons of opium into China, supplying about 3 million addicts, because that was good for Britain financially. And so we just can't rationally expect people to abstain from behavior that hurts outgroups. It's of course morally laudatory when they do, but I think it's naive of us to expect it. So at first, when I heard about the opium wars, I was just appalled. How could Britain engage in this? I was appalled when I found out that the biggest drug dealer of all time was an Orthodox Jew who ran this opium trade from India into China and the Far East. His name will come to me in a minute. But let's go back here. The myth of entangling
The United
alliances.
States may fight the wrong wars, but it will do so because its leaders miscalculate American national interests, not because other countries entangled the United States in war. The question of entangling alliances goes back to the early history of the American Republic. Presidents George Washington and Thomas Jefferson both advised their successors to keep the United States out of entangling alliances. And in fact, the phrase
perhaps the biggest drug kingpin in history was David Sassoon. He came from Iraq. His business was a monopoly of the opium trade. It extended as far as Yokohama, Nagasaki, and other cities in Japan from India. Sassoon attributed his great success to the employment of his sons as his agents and to his strict observance of Jewish law. Great, David Sassoon. So back to the Opium Wars. From 1839 to 1842, in what is now called the First Opium War, British forces occupied most of China's major coastal cities and brought Beijing to the brink of famine by blockading the Grand Canal, the lifeline linking the Chinese capital to China's rice fields in the south. Overmatched, the Chinese government capitulated in 1842. So remember, Great Britain's on one side of the world, China's on the opposite side of the world, and yet British forces were able to subdue and humiliate a country that had the largest military in the world and the largest GDP in the world. How did this happen? So the Chinese government capitulated, signed the Treaty of Nanking, giving Britain $21 million in reparations, a perpetual lease on Hong Kong, access to 5 port cities, low Chinese tariffs, and immunity from Chinese law for British citizens living in China. 15 years later, Britain upped the ante by demanding full economic access to all of China and the right to sell opium legally throughout the country. So another way of understanding this is that the strong take what they want and the weak suffer what they must. When the Chinese government resisted, Britain again used military force, sparking what is now known as the Second Opium War. January 1858, British forces occupied Guangzhou, largest port in China. In April 1858, British forces, joined by French, Russian, and U.S. diplomats, occupied Tianjin, commercial hub of northern China, 100 miles from Beijing. China mustered only little resistance, in part because its military was busy suppressing the Taiping Rebellion, the bloodiest uprising in human history. In June 1858, therefore, the Chinese government signed the Treaty of Tianjin, granting Britain and its allies access to 10 new treaty ports, freedom of travel throughout China, freedom of navigation on the Yangtze River, reparations of 6 million silver taels, and the right to sell opium in China. When the Chinese government delayed in honoring these terms, British and French forces marched on Beijing, burned down the Emperor's Summer Palace, forced the Chinese government to sign a new treaty that quadrupled China's reparations. Over the next 50 years, China will be forced to sign a dozen more unequal treaties with Britain, France, Germany, Japan, Russia, and the United States. Clearly, Britain was more powerful than China during the Opium Wars. But this is not captured by standard gross metrics. China's GDP and defense budget were more than twice the size of Britain's. China's army of 800,000 troops dwarfed the 7,000 troop force that Britain sent to China to fight the wars. China's weakness is apparent only when costs are taken into account. China suffered from greater production, welfare, and security costs than Britain, thus had fewer resources to draw on in their many disputes, whereas Britain comes out far ahead of China when power is measured by my proxy for net resources, GDP times GDP per capita. Britain never overtook China in terms of GDP total. So conventional statistical methods that dominate power analysis show that China and Britain were approximately equally matched, and that supposedly China surpassed Britain in total power in 1907, just 5 years before the Chinese government collapsed. So what were China's costs? First, China was less productive than Britain. The average unskilled worker in London generated 3 to 6 times the output of the average labor in Beijing. Each British industrial worker generated 16 to 33 times the output of each industrial worker in China. British workers were not only healthier and better educated than Chinese workers, they had better technology to do their jobs. British looms could produce 20 times the output of a Chinese hand worker. British power-driven mule spinning machines had 200 times the capacity of Chinese spinning wheels. China's massive population, which was 13 times larger than Britain's, generated substantial welfare costs. And domestic instability generated severe security costs for China. Production, welfare, and security costs drained China's seemingly vast military resources. China's military was unskilled and under-equipped compared with Britain's, and this is a really good analogy to China versus the United States today. In all areas of equipment, the British had long moved into the era of firepower, while parts of the Chinese army hung on to bows, swords, spears, and rattan shields. Repeatedly during the Opium Wars, Chinese armies of thousands were routed in minutes by a few hundred or even a few dozen British troops. Security costs degraded China's military power. Chinese forces were scattered throughout the empire, far too busy with domestic peacekeeping duties such as killing bandits to be spared for the quarrel with Britain. At any given time, 50,000 Chinese soldiers were in transit around the country suppressing revolts. Consequently, Chinese garrisons often had only a quarter of their troops on hand to counter British assaults. This is from an essay by Michael Beckley.
It's credited to Thomas Jefferson himself. Mike, you've gotten interested in this topic more recently than Jefferson and Washington did. Why is this topic important now?
Well, it's been in the news a lot lately. Just in the last few years alone, there's been serious military crises involving some U.S. allies against major military powers. So you've had disputes between China and Japan, for example, or Russia and NATO countries over Ukraine, Iran, and Israel, North and South Korea. And in all of these, President Obama has stated explicitly that the United States will defend its allies. But I think some Americans have asked, I think understandably, why are we involved here? Why is the United States risking war with Russia, China, Iran to uphold alliance agreements, a lot of which were signed 50, 60 years ago, during the Cold War. The Cold War is over. Isn't it time to disengage from these relics of that conflict? So there's this big debate right now whether the United States should start to retrench from the world or stay engaged. And I think
so. This podcast that I'm playing here with Michael Beckley has received a total of 92 listens. So why does something that's valuable, important, unique analysis will transform the way you view the world in an accurate and useful way, why does this kind of podcast get 1/1000th of the listens that a junk show like Strike and Mike gets?
The Turks held the mass at customs. They intercepted the mass.
So you'll probably be less happy, less well informed. You'll see reality less clearly if you listen to Strike and Mike, while all the other things, the opposite of that would be true if you listen to podcasts with professors like Michael Beckley. So why do people, by a ratio of about 1,000 to 1, choose trash over something that's useful? And the answer is that this Strike and Mike type podcast, it gives people who otherwise feel empty, it gives them inspiration, it gives them a feeling of community, it gives them this false idea that they have the secret knowledge that truly unlocks how the world works. It promotes this magic key thinking that the Strike and Mike show is going to give you a magic key to how the world works. And how the world works is that it's the Jews who are really running things and destroying things. So never be defensive if you do a YouTube live stream that has only 10 viewers as opposed to some other YouTube live stream that may have 5,000 viewers, because there's absolutely no correlation between the number of viewers and the quality. So the Strike and Mike show would be listened to by thousands and thousands of people, and until I played Michael Beckley's SoundCloud podcast, only been listened to by 92 people, yet the merit of what Michael Beckley has to say just so vastly outweighs much of what's being relayed here on Strike and Mike.
On their way to Italy, where the masks are fucking in really short supply, it's an emergency, and their NATO ally not only intercepted the masks, they won't refund their money.
And
that's real cockroach
where did
behavior
these masks
right
end
there.
up? Like,
they're just in customs in Turkey.
Okay, I was going to say, are these the ones that Israel nabbed? So that wouldn't shock me either. But yeah.
the Turkish businesses were saying they could build 50 million masks. They could produce 50 million masks.
That's quite a few masks.
Right. It's got to be Israel. Right. It's got to be the Jews.
Yeah, they could build. they could manufacture it very quickly, and yet.
Now, of course, Eric Stryker and Mike Petovich, I'm forgetting his stage name. They don't have any expertise in these areas, but they feel very qualified to state these very broad pronouncements.
200,000, the Turkish government, and people are saying they're not doing it because they need them. They're doing it because they want to see Europeans die.
So why would people, by a ratio of 1,000 times, 10,000 times, rather listen to this kind of analysis rather than thoughtful, incisive analysis by a professor who actually knows what he's talking about, who has expertise that has been gained over many years of hard study. His work has been peer-reviewed. So good question, but people will frequently choose trash over work that is not as exciting, that doesn't give as much of an emotional reward of a magic key that you'll get on Strike and Mike, but will still enable you to see life more clearly.
To inform that debate, we need to do a lot of research about what are the costs and benefits of these alliances. And so I've focused on what I think is the major cost of alliances, getting dragged into wars against your interests. And I've basically found that the costs have been relatively minimal for the United States. And so whether the benefits outweigh them, I think it's actually pretty likely.
Well, it's a fascinating conclusion. that the United States actually doesn't get dragged into war by.
And what's going on in India? So health workers are trying to keep people in lockdown are getting attacked.
झाड़ बुलाने आ रहा है बार बार ये लोग चूतिए
So what do you think the average IQ is of the people who are attacking the health workers? It's probably something like 80, 85. The health workers probably have an average IQ of around 100. So you have the smart people trying to save the dumb people from dying, but the dumb people are able to drive out the smart people. And we have similar problems in the United States, where smart people will try to promote policies that stupid people will try to destroy. So the average IQ of people in prison, something around 90. Back to Professor Michael Beckley on the myth of entangling alliances.
So-called entangling alliances. How do you reach that conclusion? What's the evidence to support this argument?
So I analyzed every U.S. military conflict since 1948, which is the year that the United States signed its first standing alliance. There's 188 conflicts in total, and I asked a basic question: to what extent was U.S. involvement in these conflicts driven by some type of alliance, formal alliance obligation? And so it required careful historical research, getting the declassified documents, and seeing what was really driving U.S. policymakers in each of these cases.
When you looked at all of these cases, what did you find was the basic logic of what was going on? Why doesn't the United States find itself being drawn into war by its alliance commitments?
I think there's several explanations that you see consistent evidence for. One is that these alliance treaties, first of all, are pretty vague. They don't say that the United States has to come in guns blazing and defend its allies to the death. They say things like act together to meet the common danger in line with your constitutional process. So there's some wiggle room there, and the United States, because it's so much more powerful than any of its allies, can kind of dictate what that actually means in practice. So the U.S. has been has done a good job, essentially, of limiting its liability for allied conflicts. So maybe supporting allies diplomatically rather than militarily, or if they do it militarily, to do so with air power or something that keeps most American ground troops out of the conflict. But at the same time, it's done a great job of actually pulling allies into U.S. wars. So I think a lot of this has to do with the asymmetry in power. At the end of the day, allies depend on the United States a lot more than vice versa, so the United States can structure the terms of these alliance agreements to privilege its own interests.
Now, do allies actually restrain the United States from potentially unnecessary wars in some cases?
They have on some occasions. They've tried to in a lot of occasions. In fact, what I found is, the United States has this huge alliance network, 68 different countries. They're all over in different regions. And what often happens is in any given conflict, only a few allies actually want the United States to intervene. They're directly threatened by the conflict. The rest of the allies who are in other regions actually want the United States to stay out because they don't want the U.S. to drain its resources in some faraway conflict or escalate that conflict into a global war that could include them. British leaders call this annihilation without representation. So to avoid that, they actually lobby the United States and say, stay out of this conflict.
Looking at a tweet here from Matt Walsh, he says, I'm getting a ton of pushback from conservatives over my article and show today criticizing the government for arresting Christian pastors. I'm shocked that even people on the right would accept this state of affairs without question. I shouldn't be shocked, but I am. Yeah, I accept it. I'm prepared to be wrong, but it seems to me from where I stand that one of government's primary responsibilities is to keep people safe. And if you have a massive pandemic that is killing thousands of people, and we don't know the extent of it, then it makes sense to me shutting churches, shutting synagogues. Okay, here's a clip of Vush on Cotto Gottfried commenting on the rise of the Groyper right. So here we. Oh, I've already played this one. Ashi. So I'm not going to play it again. Let me go back here to this essay by Michael Beckley. Talks about Japan versus China, 1874 to 1945. So how did China, with a much bigger GDP and a much bigger armed forces, consistently lose to Japan in these conflicts over the course of about 75 years? China's misery did not end with the Opium Wars. In the latter half of the 19th century, Japan became determined not to suffer the same fate as China, so it revamped its government, economy, and military, began seizing territory and resources in East Asia. So one way that you can understand the unitary systems of France and England is that they're essentially set up to be able to most effectively wage war against each other. When China tried to stand in the way of Japan's imperialist plans, Japan went on a rampage, quickly defeated China's military in 1894, forced it to sign a humiliating treaty. China was also forced to recognize Korea's independence, which meant that Korea would become a vassal of Japan, no longer of China, and would give Japan commercial rights in China and a massive indemnity. After pocketing these gains, Japan annexed Korea in 1910, and when World War I broke out in 1914, Japan entered the war on the Allies' side and seized the German-controlled city of Qingdao in China's Shandong Peninsula. Japan then presented China with the infamous 21 demands, which essentially called for China to become a Japanese ward. The United States forced Japan to abandon its most punishing demands, but Japan still extracted substantial territorial and economic concessions from China. So why was Japan so much more powerful than China during the late 19th and early 20th centuries? China had far greater power resources by standard metrics. China's population, GDP, and military was several times larger than Japan's, but Japan was much more efficient than China, with lower production, welfare, and security costs, and was thus able to garner a preponderance of net resources. So first, Japanese industry was much more productive than China's. Welfare costs also worked in Japan's favor, and security costs took a smaller toll on Japan's economy than they did in China's. And in military affairs, the story was similar. One study concludes Chinese forces lost every major confrontation on the battlefield and were inferior in organization, equipment, training, and leadership to the Japanese army. Typical Chinese military unit spent the bulk of its time and energy simply trying to preserve its existence. It expected to have to take care of its own needs, including food, clothing, conscripts, weapons, and transportation. Fighting consumed too much energy, so fighting was done only when absolutely necessary. When sufficiently desperate, soldiers would not hesitate to pillage the very same people they were supposed to protect. This promoted friction between the army and the civilian population. And Chinese forces suffered substantial security costs because China was internally divided. Then next section in this essay is Germany versus Russia, 1891 to 1917. For most of the 19th century, Russia had the largest GDP and military in Europe. During this conflict, however, Russia suffered a steady slackening of power and prestige and a series of crushing military defeats that culminated in the collapse of the Russian Empire in 1917.
And sometimes they're successful. There are a number of success cases in Laos and over Berlin conflicts. And in other cases, they try and they fail. So Vietnam is a key case there. Even, I would say, in the Iraq 2003 war, you had certain...
Okay, Ashi insists that I haven't played this particular sound clip here of Vush on Cotto Gottfried.
Fairly prolonged sort of... on average, they're waiting longer to have like a relationship for the first time. And life just seems to be getting lonelier for everyone, but especially for the young man. And if you're just like a little unattractive or a little socially awkward, sometimes that feels like it's a death sentence on your ability to make anything out of your life in a social sense. All you have left to look forward to is some, middling, like 1-bedroom apartment where you can eke out an income at some wage slave jobs. It's very depressing and it's very atomizing, and it's a product of the economic circumstances we live in. But the masculinity hurts the most, I think. That gets personal to some folks. You you get into the thick of things and you think like, well, why is this the issue? Well, of course, you have the lefties and the liberals, the soy boys and the beta males who are making men weak, and weak men make a weak society. And they also attract women into patterns of relationship finding that are unequitable and damaging to society as a whole. Women are having, less babies. They're going out and working. They should be staying at home taking care of kids. I deserve a wife. I need a wife. Where is my wife? You go further down, women are actually degenerates because they've been, subjected to all this propaganda. And if you go further down, like, oh, who's doing the propagandizing? Well, it is, of course, the Jews who pump in pornography, which is interracial, to encourage race mixing, which destroys the white man. And you go further and further and further down, and you either find an ideal or you succumb to nihilism. And I don't know which one is better, mind you, because there are nihilistic fascists out there and neo-Nazis. And I've argued with these people, and they have no political prescriptions. They have none. What they say is like, we want trad wives, we want traditional wives, barefoot and pregnant in the household. We want a white country, we want to return to what we used to have. But all of it is supplanted through this veneer, this film of like online irony and disaffection and honestly suicide lust. So many of these people are miserable that their apathy, it basically seems like a breeding ground for the occasional lone wolf terrorist. And beyond that, they have no broader political prescriptions beyond making life hell for other people online, because these people are horrible. They really, really are. And I feel for them. I really do. I wish they weren't like that, but they're horrible. And then the ones who find this ideal, like you said with the Nick Fuentes types, they've been reverting back like really quickly. It's crazy, to this traditional fundamentalist, in this case, Catholicism, not Christianity. The reason why Christianity seems to be sort of less in vogue with these people is because they don't like the fact that American fundamentalist Christians are very rabidly pro-Israel. And of course, these people, the Catholics, are invariably also neo-Nazis.
That's absurd. Roman Catholicism is very much a part of Christianity. Roman Catholicism is not something that's separate from Christianity.
And these people are more principled. And I think for that reason, they're more dangerous. These are the types you can form a political party around. Their apathy is there, but it's couched in a much more insidious group identity that they can use to sort of manifest. Nick Fuentes successfully leveraged that identity to harass conferences being held by Turning Point USA, which is another conservative, a sort of activist group. He sent his neo-Nazi fans to these conferences, and he would have them ask questions, like neo-Nazi questions, like, why do you support Israel? Why do you support gay people? Are you really a conservative if you accept gay people? That sort of stuff.
Those are not neo-Nazi questions. There's nothing remotely neo-Nazi about those kind of questions. That's absurd. All right, let me go back to this podcast interview. Professor Michael Beckley on the myth of entangling alliances.
U.S. allies trying to prevent the United States from getting too deeply involved. So they try a lot. Sometimes they succeed. Sometimes they fail.
Well, it is fascinating that the United States actually limits its liability, and somewhat paradoxical that by having so many allies, it avoids being dragged in a particular direction by any one of them. But I know you found some cases, a handful, in which it looked like there was a case. The United States had been entangled by its ally in a war that might not have been in U.S. national interest. Can you say a little bit more about those?
Yeah, I think the 5 cases that really stood out from all the others in terms of the effect of alliance politics on U.S. decision-making and the extent of U.S. military involvement in the conflict were 2 different crises in the Taiwan Strait, one in 1954, another in 1995, 1996. The Vietnam War, there is evidence that alliance politics played a role in U.S. decision-making. And then the conflicts in Bosnia and Kosovo in the 1990s. However, and in the article, I go through each of these in sort of painstaking detail, but in even these, I think, are not clear-cut cases, because in each there were other major drivers of U.S. behavior in the conflict besides alliance politics. U.S. leaders actually did a pretty good job limiting U.S. involvement at the behest of allies, or the alliance institutions themselves helped keep a lid on the conflict and prevent it from escalating. So usually one of those things is true, and I think mitigates the overall extent of entanglement. But if you're looking for cases, those those 5 stood out. They're highlighted a lot by historians, and I found some evidence in all of them, but I think still not nearly as clear-cut of evidence as I expected going into the project.
So in some of these cases, you found that there actually wasn't much U.S. involvement. There wasn't much U.S. fighting in a war that seemed to be related to the alliances. In other cases, was it more a question of U.S. national interests determining the outcome as opposed to the alliance commitment? And how does Vietnam fit in?
Right. So I think within these 5 cases, the case where I found the most effect of alliance politics on U.S. decision-making had the least amount of military action. So in the Taiwan Straits crisis in 1995, 1996, China is shooting missiles around Taiwan to protest what they saw as movements towards independence. And, 6 to 8 months later, the United States sends 2 aircraft carrier battle groups towards Taiwan. But it turns out that behind the scenes, American policymakers have been meeting with Chinese officials, and they reassured each other that neither side wanted to escalate, that the U.S. wouldn't support Taiwanese independence. And so while the United States made a show of force to show support for Taiwan, of course, no conflict, fortunately, broke out. And I think most scholars who have analyzed the case closely argue that the risks to U.S. Forces were pretty minimal at the time. Vietnam is the exact opposite. So Vietnam, of course, horrible, one of the most costly wars in U.S. history, terrible case of overreach. But there, I think, you can really trace U.S. involvement in Vietnam all the way to the late 1940s, early 1950s, where there's this overriding interest in containing Soviet, Chinese expansion and the spread of communism there. And then I think later on, a lot of scholars who have studied Lyndon Johnson or Richard Nixon's decision-making say it's both these, perhaps some of these Cold War factors, as well as personal factors. Neither of those presidents wanted to be the first president to lose a war. They were thinking about their domestic agenda legacy. So I think their alternative explanations explain the vast majority of U.S. actions. And while there is some evidence of alliance politics and decision-making, it's not nearly as decisive as in some of the other cases.
So I'm not sure if it's reassuring or not, but you're essentially saying, at least in Vietnam and maybe some of these other cases, the United States is perfectly capable of making major blunders on its own. It doesn't need its alliance commitments and alliance politics to lead it into foolish wars or unnecessary conflicts.
That's right. I mean, I think one of the key takeaways of the article is that I'm not saying the United States doesn't do stupid stuff. It has done stupid stuff on several horrible occasions, but it hasn't been entangling alliances. It's been more what some scholars have called self-entanglement, this tendency to exaggerate threats, whether it's to exaggerate the spread of communism in Southeast Asia, or I think after 9/11, 9/11 really primed the country to lash out militarily and played a role in driving the United States into the Iraq War, which is another case of overreach. So it's really these domestic factors that I think matter much more than a case of alliances dragging the United States kicking and screaming in. These were deliberate decisions made by U.S. officials.
But there's another side to this coin as well. In the debates over current U.S. foreign policy, and indeed in historical cases, we hear a lot about the need to uphold American credibility. The United States has to stick by its allies, otherwise its credibility will be gravely damaged. And I just wondered how that fits in, because this is a very common theme in the debate over U.S. foreign policy and has been for years.
I think leaders in general talk about we're going to defend our allies in public. They say we're going to defend our allies to the death. We're behind them. But I think it's important to look at what they say in private. And there's no doubt that credibility concerns have shaped decision-making for the United States. The United States has fought bloody wars to maintain credibility, but I think primarily vis-a-vis adversaries and neutral countries. So this idea that we have to look tough, we have to draw a line in the sand, we have to prevent appeasement of adversaries so they know when to stop. What I see less of is fighting wars just to show loyalty to allies. It's certainly a concern that often gets raised in decision-making, but it's rarely the decisive factor propelling the United States into these wars. And if you think about it, it makes sense, because I think American policymakers calculate that, look, these allies, they are dependent on us for security. They will take what they can get, essentially, and there's not a big risk of all of our allies turning tail on us. The big risk is looking weak in the face of some of these adversaries. So as a result, we need to stand firm. And so that seems to be that type of credibility seems to matter a lot more than allied credibility when you look at the record.
Okay, so if the United States really isn't influenced by this perceived need to maintain credibility with its allies, and if the historical record suggests that there haven't been too many wars in which the United States was somehow entangled by an ally, and that even in some of those cases, U.S. national interests and misperceptions, perhaps, drove U.S. foreign policy much more than the pressure from an ally, why does this belief, what you call a myth, of entangling alliances endure?
I think part of it may be because early exalted American leaders like Washington and Jefferson warned against them. I think it creates an easy way to understand debacles. It's always easier to blame outsiders for your own foibles than to look internally and say, well, how did we screw this decision up? How did we overreach in this case? So there may be something to just being able to externalize the blame, frankly, for a lot of these mistakes in U.S. foreign policy. And it's also a catchy phrase, entangling alliances. It creates.
So one of the important things in this podcast, and learning this is a podcast I only listen to 90 people before I play it, there are a lot of valuable insights in here. One of them is that a catchy phrase will grab people's attention even if it does not correspond to reality, even if it distorts your understanding of reality. So Striker Mike's going to get 10,000 times the number of listeners as this podcast with Professor Michael Beckley, because he's not as exciting, he's not throwing around the F word, he's not blaming it all on the Jews. But to understand the world, generally speaking, public policy insights that are exciting, glib, provocative, get you all emotionally charged up, that they distort your understanding of reality rather than increasing your understanding of reality. And someone else who lives in a world of delusion is Jim Acosta from CNN. So there's a new book out by ABC News correspondent called Front Row at the Trump Show. He says that Jim Acosta acts like an opinion journalist who has played right into the explicit Trump strategy of portraying the press as the opposition party. So I think to Jim Acosta, his showboating, it's about his ego, but it doesn't really help you understand reality. So ABC correspondent Jonathan Karl says many media figures have mistaken editorializing for journalism since Trump took office. A sub-theme of the book is those of us reporters make a mistake if they appear to be too much like an opposition to the president or the resistance. And Karl is the president of the White House Correspondents Association. That's not our job. We are not the opposition party. We're supposed to report and report aggressively on the president, but not to go over the top. And Karl singles out Jim Acosta for his dramatic sparring match with then White House Press Secretary Sarah Huckabee Sanders in 2018. Karl says there's a moment that could have been scripted by Trump, adding that he's also been tempted to get on my soapbox like Acosta did. Surest way to undermine the credibility of the White House press corps is to behave like the political opposition. Don't give speeches from the White House briefing room. Don't talk about holding protests against the president in Lafayette Square. Karl is the latest veteran reporter to take issue with Jim Acosta's behavior. The Atlantic's Todd Purdom wrote that Acosta's back and forth with Sanders played directly into Trump's received narrative about a hostile, combative, and even unfair press. Karl also criticizes Acosta for a 2017 incident, which then President-elect Trump called Acosta fake news. He refused to call on Acosta, who then interrupted NPR's Mara Liasson and repeatedly tried to ask his question. Acosta was portraying himself as some kind of righteous advocate for the press, but to most reporters he was just rudely interrupting a colleague. And Fox News' Chris Wallace called Acosta a showboat who embarrassed himself. CBS correspondent Major Garrett made similar criticisms. Pointner's Al Tompkins wrote that Acosta became the news story rather than doing his job. And Chris Wallace says he was horrified by Jim Acosta's conduct at press conferences. 2017, Joe Scarborough of MSNBC said Acosta sounded like he was comparing the Trump administration to Nazi Germany during an exchange with Stephen Miller over immigration policy. Sure sounded like something you would have read out of Mein Kampf. So yeah, Jim Acosta, showboat does not help you understand reality.
It's a very easy way to package some kind of foreign policy mistake. I'm not a sociologist, but if I had to guess, it's something along those lines.
Well, let's talk a little bit more about the contemporary implications of your argument. Now, you said before the United States has dozens.
So it's not as exciting, right, to listen to a calm, reasoned podcast like this one with Michael Beckley put out by Harvard University. But you'll get a lot of insight into how the world works.
Of allies. Who are they? Where are they? And with so many, isn't it at least more likely that the United States will be dragged into war somewhere?
Mm-hmm. So the United States has 68 formal allies, meaning there's some treaty or some consistent set of presidential statements saying we will support these countries if they come under attack. So I think it's easiest to think about them in terms of three big blobs and a dot. So the first blob is in the Western Hemisphere. 33 countries are allied to the United States through the Organization of American States. It's founded in 1948, expands over the course of the Cold War. The second blob is in Europe. So NATO includes 27 countries. And then the third blob is really more of a chain that runs north to south through maritime East Asia. So you have Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, where there's not a formal alliance treaty, but the U.S. has the Taiwan Relations Act. So it's the U.S. law to help Taiwan provide for security. The Philippines, and then all the way down in the south, you have Australia. So this north to south chain. And then you have this dot. You have Israel in the Middle East, where, again, the United States doesn't have a formal alliance treaty, but I count it as a formal American ally because U.S. presidents since Kennedy in '62, as far as I know, have said that the United States will defend, have said publicly that the United States will defend Israel if it comes under attack. So if you add all this together, that's 25% of the world's population, 5 continents, 75% of the global economy. So it's a massive commitment. And so I think it makes logical sense that these could drag the United States in. But to get back to your question, it almost seems like the diversified nature of the alliance portfolio actually forces the United States to pick its spots more when it aids its allies, because it comes under tremendous pressure from other allies to not throw its lot in too much with any particular ally, to not allow any specific ally to goad it into a war that would severely undermine its power or security.
One of the alliances that has raised a lot of concern lately is part of the NATO alliance, and it's the alliance of the United States with the Baltic countries, Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia. Now, these countries obviously have a number of disputes with Russia, and Russia has shown a propensity to act assertively, maybe even aggressively, in Ukraine, where the United States does not have an alliance. What do you think the risk is of the United States being drawn into an overt conflict with Russia because of these NATO alliances with Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia?
I do think the risk is definitely higher there than for the vast majority of other U.S. alliances. I think the most risky alliances in general are those where the states in question are strong enough to get into trouble, to start a fight, but they're too weak to finish the fight by themselves. So it would be dependent on the U.S. And the country they're picking a fight with cares a lot more about the issues at stake than the United States does. That's a very scary recipe, and Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia are a major concern, rightly so. However, I do think that it's, if I were betting, I think it's less likely that there will be serious entanglement for a number of reasons. I think that, as long as the United States doesn't bring Georgia and Ukraine into NATO, there are some natural buffers there. I also think there are weaknesses in Russia's military. But I certainly don't want to say that entanglement is not an issue at all. It's just that historically it's been a manageable issue, that the United States has been able to modulate the amount of support that it gives for certain allies, to work behind the scenes, to negotiate both with its allies, restrain them from doing anything provocative, and try to deter potential non-allies. So my analysis of the historical record makes me fairly confident there's not going to be serious entanglement there, but I would never say that there's zero risk, and that is certainly a flashpoint where this could happen.
Are there any other countries that are U.S. allies that might be in a high risk or at least a riskier category along with the Baltic states?
Okay, bad news. Brooklyn man busted for selling personal protection equipment, then coughing on FBI agents and telling them he had coronavirus. Baruch Feldheim, 43, was arrested by FBI agents in New Jersey, charged with assaulting a federal officer and with making false statements to law enforcement. Feldheim had accumulated much-needed N95 respirators, personal protection, surgical masks, medical gowns, and disinfecting devices, selling them to healthcare professionals at inflated prices. One instance, a doctor in New Jersey contacted Feldheim via WhatsApp chat group labeled Virus 2020. Feldheim agreed to sell to the doctor approximately 1,000 N95 masks and other assorted materials for $12,000, a 700% markup from the normal price. Feldheim then directed the doctor to an auto repair store in Irvington, New Jersey. And then the FBI swooped in.
I think in Asia, Taiwan and the Philippines are the ones that scare me the most, because again, you have that bad witch's brew of, they're strong enough to get into trouble, probably not, they're a lot weaker than China, they have major disputes with, and China cares a lot more, especially in the case of Taiwan, about the issues at stake. And in my historical analysis, Taiwan incorporates 2 of the 5 cases that I find much more evidence of entanglement than in the rest. So those are the ones that keep me up at night. But again, in general, I'm fairly confident that U.S. policymakers can manage this issue.
So what should we do? Are there any alliances that need to be reconsidered? And what overall course should the United States chart?
Yeah, I think this study provides help for that, but it certainly doesn't answer all the questions, because we need to know, well, then what are the benefits? And what are the other costs? There are other costs to alliances that I don't consider at all. Like, the U.S. probably has to maintain higher levels of defense spending to be prepared to defend its allies. It probably hurts relationships with countries like China, that the United States has a close relationship with a country like Taiwan, with an entity like Taiwan. So, there are other factors that need to be considered. And in general, my main advice for policy would be to focus on domestic reforms that we can make. We can.
Shipping records show a massive flow of key medical supplies from American ports to foreign buyers, while the United States is dithered. Well, this vital medical equipment, such as respirators and ventilators, have been loaded onto cargo ships for markets in Asia and Europe.
The alliance portfolio, but I think change at the core has to come from within. And so what I would like to see is stronger institutional constraints on the president's ability to send U.S. forces into battle. Historically, the Congress is supposed to declare war, and the president and the Congress are supposed to work that out. But over the last few decades, presidents have been able to get around that by just not calling major military interventions wars. I think we need to reassert Congress's role so that there's some check on this. And then the second issue is more for American society. I think we need to make guidelines governing the use of force something that we talk about as a nation. And there's, the Powell Doctrine or the Weinberger Doctrine, these lists of questions that we need to ask ourselves before every major military intervention. Will the intervention, are the interests at stake vital? Is there a clear exit strategy for when we get into this conflict? Is there a clear, attainable objective? And have we exhausted all the nonviolent means to resolve this conflict? I think being much more systematic as a nation when we debate whether to intervene in various conflicts, these kind of domestic reforms are what's really key to prevent egregious U.S. overreach.
Okay, so coronavirus has shown the extent of China's influence in the World Health Organization, but that influence is part of a larger strategy of protecting and projecting, using China's role in international organizations to protect Chinese Communist Party rule and to project influence abroad. Is an essay from Bloomberg.
China's global influence operation goes way beyond the WHO. The viral video really does tell the story. Over the weekend, a senior advisor at the World Health Organization abruptly shut down an interview after being asked about Taiwan's role in the organization. The episode has been interpreted correctly as a marker of how China has used the WHO as a tool in its diplomatic struggle to isolate and delegitimize a democratic Taiwan. Yet China's influence in the WHO is only a small part of a much larger story involving Beijing's relationship to international organizations. For decades, U.S. officials hoped that bringing Beijing into those organizations would change China, by socializing it into the patterns of responsible global governance. They paid less attention to the danger that has now materialized, that China might change those organizations instead. The logic behind America's responsible stakeholder approach was that the best way to keep China from challenging the international order was to demonstrate that it could thrive within it. Encouraging Beijing to expand its role in international organizations, from the United Nations to the alphabet soup of bodies dealing with specific issues from international communications to civil air traffic, was crucial. It would show Chinese officials the virtues of positive-sum cooperation in dealing with global challenges, from nuclear proliferation to management of the world economy. It would accustom Beijing to exercising leadership in a constructive, responsible fashion. It would promote, as Deputy Secretary of State Robert Zoellick argued in 2005, the emergence of a China that not only adjusts to the international rules developed over the last century, but also joins us and others to address the challenges of the new century. The policy appeared to be working, for a while. A country that had once shunned international organizations now increasingly embraced them. China became one of the largest contributors to UN peacekeeping missions around the world. In 2018, President Xi Jinping pledged that Beijing would take an active part in leading the reform of the global governance system, as part of China's commitment to building a community with a shared future for humanity. But what Xi and other Chinese leaders meant was not what U.S. officials had in mind. Chinese officials had seen how international organizations could be used against it when Beijing found itself attacked in the UN after the Tiananmen Square massacre in 1989. So Beijing came to see its role in these institutions as one of protecting and protecting the dominance of the Chinese Communist Party at home, while projecting the party's influence and values abroad. China's state press agency has acknowledged this in the candid but oblique language in which the regime often describes its aims. The purpose of participating in global governance is to create a favorable environment for the rise of a great modern socialist country. It is only natural that China's role in the WHO has garnered the most attention right now. As Beijing has raised its participation in, and contributions to, that organization, it has also wielded it as a diplomatic lever against Taiwan, allowing the Taiwanese to play a greater role when the island is ruled by leaders deemed friendly to China, and pushing it to the margins when those deemed hostile are in charge. And this strategy extends far beyond the WHO. For example, China has employed its sway within the International Civil Aviation Organization, including the presence of Chinese nationals in key leadership positions, to marginalize Taiwan by denying it permission to attend meetings. After a former Chinese official was elected Secretary General of the UN International Telecommunications Union in 2014, that body became far friendlier to Beijing's Digital Silk Road project, which is meant to allow China to dominate the world's most advanced communications networks, as well as its efforts to make the Internet more conducive to authoritarian control. Within the UN Human Rights Council, Chinese representatives have sought to shield Beijing from scrutiny of its own abuses, while also promoting alternative concepts of human rights that stress state sovereignty, social harmony and other characteristics more suitable to autocracy than liberty. Similarly, according to an analysis by Brett Schaefer of the Heritage Foundation, a Chinese head of the UN Department of Economic and Social Affairs used his position to discriminate against people and organizations, drawing attention to Beijing's repression of the Uyghur ethnic group in the far western region of Xinjiang. The Chinese government has also sought, sometimes successfully, to position Chinese nationals at the head of Interpol, the World Intellectual Property Organization, and other obscure but important bodies that quietly exercise influence in global affairs. The Chinese regime, as the saying goes, may have dropped its Marxism, but it has kept its Leninism, the tendency to see nearly all interactions as part of a fierce contest for power. Its goal has been to position itself near the center of these important international networks, not so much to strengthen global governance as to strengthen its own ability to shape global norms. Beijing realizes that this competition in rulemaking and norm shaping will be a central front in the struggle for a global leadership in the 21st century. The question is whether the U.S. realizes it, too. The Donald Trump administration deserves credit for mounting a strong campaign to defeat Beijing's candidate to lead the intellectual property body, averting the absurdity of the world's foremost violator of intellectual property rights gaining greater power over global standards for patents and other aspects of international commerce. The State Department has drawn greater attention to China's strategy and the imperative of countering it. Yet there are also contradictory tendencies in the administration. Trump has withdrawn from the UN's Human Rights Council and Economic, Social and Cultural Organization, undermined the World Trade Organization, and too often been dismissive of the international institutions and norms through which the U.S. has long exercised its own power. All this has created voids that China will exploit. In cold geopolitical terms, the countries that invest in international organizations are most likely to reap the benefits of influence within them. It would be a sad irony if the U.S. forgot this fact at a time when China has most assuredly discovered it.
Looking at Twitter, Stephen Mnuchin, the Treasury Secretary, is still negotiating with airlines on the $25 billion bailout. His goal is to force the airlines to give taxpayers an equity stake or some sort of collateral. So if the airlines don't agree, of course they can go elsewhere to try to find a better deal. The emerging military balance in East Asia. Here is Michael Beckley back on this Harvard University podcast. He explains how China's maritime neighbors can prevent China from dominating East Asia militarily.
I'm Sean Lynn Jones. I edit the quarterly journal International Security here at the Belfer Center at Harvard Kennedy School. Today, I'm talking to Michael Beckley. He's a professor at Tufts University in political science, and he's also the author of an article that's just appeared in International Security. The article is called The Emerging Military Balance in East Asia, How China's Neighbors Can Check Chinese Naval Expansion. It's now available in the fall 2018 issue. It's online and copies have been mailed out as well. It's good to have you here today, Mike.
Thanks for having me, Sean.
Even though your article has just been published and has just become available to subscribers, it's already moving right up near the top of the list of the most viewed articles on the MIT Press website for the journal. So it's clearly attracting some readers and some interest, which is great. I wondered if you could tell me why this topic is so important right now and why it's getting this kind of attention.
Yeah, China claims ownership of roughly 80% of the East and South China Seas. And in recent years, it's really ramped up its efforts to enforce those claims. So it's been putting military installations in the South China Sea. It's been harassing the aircraft and ships of foreign countries. And a lot of analysts think that China's ultimate goal is to essentially turn these seas into a Chinese lake where it calls the shots, it decides who gets in and who gets out. And if China were to enforce even a fraction of these claims, it would be the largest territorial expansion of any country since World War II. China would effectively control what are arguably the most important waterways in the world. A third of world trade goes through these seas. China's neighbors would be confined to their coastlines and basically become vassals of China. The international law on the sea would basically become, a dead letter. And China could then start projecting military force out into the Pacific and Indian Oceans, which of course would have huge implications for the global balance of power. So there's a lot at stake in these territorial disputes and in the East Asian military balance.
Yeah, there's certainly been a lot of news coverage of China's actions in the South China Sea and a lot of concern and debate over exactly what China's going to do, both tactically and strategically. What's the argument of your article? How are you contributing to this discussion?
China's neighbors are starting to push back. So I show in the article, they're contesting China's claims. They're building up their militaries. And I argue that with some help from the United States, they could plausibly deny China sea and air control throughout a big chunk of its near seas.
Okay, if they can actually develop this sort of military capability, tell me more about how you reach that conclusion. How can they deny China's ability to control the sea and air lanes here?
I conduct what defense planners call campaign analyses. So these are basically rigorous assessments of combat scenarios where you look at the capabilities of each country's weapon systems, the skill of their military units, geography and their political objectives, and using a combination of qualitative analysis and with the help of some computer simulations, you try to figure out, to what extent can China's neighbors fight off China over territory that they claim. So can Taiwan defend itself against a Chinese invasion or a Chinese blockade? To what extent can Japan deny China control of the East China Sea? Can Indonesia, Malaysia, the Philippines, Vietnam fight off China in their parts of the South China Sea? So it's basically a nitty-gritty, dynamic military analysis.
In your article, you talk about how it certainly wouldn't be easy for China to engage in expansion in this area. What are the big obstacles that would prevent China's expansion just in general, beyond the nitty-gritty of the military capabilities?
The two main ones are geography and technology. So geographically, China's neighbors would have home field advantage. They border the territories that they claim, whereas China is hundreds, in some cases 1,000 miles away from these disputed areas. So in most scenarios for war, Chinese forces are going to have to be commuting back and forth between the Chinese mainland and the battlefield, the combat zone. Whereas China's neighbors, they'll have much shorter commutes for their forces. They'll be able to sustain much higher tempos of operation. And as a result, they'll be able to draw on a much bigger chunk of their forces and bring them to bear. So distance, in other words, sort of mitigates China's military superiority.
And how does technology come into this?
Right.
How does technology in some way level the playing field between the very large forces of China and its regional adversaries in this area?
Yeah, so, 50 years ago, China's neighbors would have had to fight China straight up. They just have to send battleships out to blast away at China's fleet. But today, with the advent of precision-guided munitions and the spread of these very accurate missiles that even weak countries have gotten their hands on by this point, China's neighbors can fight China asymmetrically by taking these missiles and just launching them from hundreds of miles away at Chinese forces from very cheap platforms like trucks or small ships, short-range aircraft. So there's asymmetries in technology that work in the favor of defenders, in this case, China's neighbors.
But I think one point that your article makes that's important to remember is all of this assumes that the countries in East Asia, South China Sea area would have the will to deploy these technologies and to develop these military capabilities and to use them. Is that right?
That's right. So my analysis is focused on the military balance, about what these countries could do if they employed their militaries. But I think, an important companion study would assess kind of the domestic politics in these countries and try to figure out their resolve to actually stand up to China. Now, I personally happen to think that a lot of these countries have already made it very clear that they're willing to fight to defend what they regard as their sovereign territory and their exclusive economic zones. Some countries are seizing Chinese fishing vessels and blowing them up on national TV. You've had a number of spats in the South China Sea and obviously between Japan and China in the East China Sea. So I don't get the impression that these countries are just going to roll over, but I can't rule that out because I'm focused on the military aspect. We need to study more also the resolve factor.
Okay, looking at Twitter, Darren Beatty tweets, "There's a certain courage in admitting one's cowardice, having the self-awareness of saying, you are right, but I can't go there, no stomach for it. Alternative, cowards create entire systems of belief to justify and hide their weakness from others and from themselves." And good debate in The Critic, between Toby Young and Sam Bowman. Is this shutdown worth it? Toby made an argument no one wants to hear. The shutdown is not worth it. And then Sam produces a quite rational counter-argument. So they're worth looking at, and I'll share. Due to the 20% racial wage gap between Asian men and white men, so Asian men earn on average $1,240 a week. White men earn on average $1,000 a week. White men have to work until today, April 1st, to earn the same pay as Asian men earned last year. Okay, let's look at this response here by Sam Bowman. So Toby Young tries to measure the costs and benefits of the current coronavirus shutdown, and he says that this shutdown's a bad idea. He's right to recognize that lost economic output has real costs and that trade-offs of any policy have to be considered before we can judge whether that policy is worthwhile, but he makes several important errors. First, Young argues that we should judge that the life expectancy of people who would die from COVID-19 is 1 year. but the average life expectancy of someone who's made it to the age of 80 is more than 81. It says that the value of a life year in the UK is £30,000. That is not the same as the value of a life year to society, which places it 60,000 to 100,000 pounds. So Young's initial calculation of the benefits of saving marginal life are up to 18 times lower than they would be if he'd used the Treasury statistical life year figures and accurate life expectancy data. Toby Young looks at money spent by the government as the true cost of the shutdown, but he uses a muddled figure. 350 billion he uses from the rescue package announcement. This is not actual government spending, it is loan guarantees that only cost the taxpayer if those loans are defaulted on. The biggest cost to taxpayers is likely to be the government's employee retention scheme. This is cash payments, so for everyone losing money, there's someone gaining the same amount. How big is the loss of output from the shutdown likely to be? Morgan Stanley projects a 5% GDP loss for the United Kingdom in 2020, followed by a 5.6% rebound in 2021. So assuming that we return to such GDP growth in 2021, that gives a total GDP loss of about 3%, or about 66 billion in lost output. Most of the government's fiscal response is designed precisely to avoid a long enduring recession after the shutdown is over. So the net cost of the shutdown is less than 66 billion. In a scenario where hundreds of thousands of people were dying, the National Health Service would become overwhelmed and the average age of the people dying would fall, so the number of life years lost would dramatically increase, and there would be a significant cost to the economy of giving serious medical treatment to the millions of people who needed it if we don't go into a lockdown. Serious costs in terms of human suffering as well. All this suggests that so far the shutdown is worth it, and probably would be worth it for some time more. 3 months would seem to be well worth it if it saves hundreds of thousands or even millions of life years, and it is right for the government to spend as much as it is to keep businesses and workers afloat so we can bounce back once this is over and to minimize the real economic costs of the shutdown. A longer period of shutdown may also be worthwhile if necessary. So interesting debate there on whether or not the shutdown is worth it.
Well, your military analysis certainly suggests that these countries shouldn't give up hope and that they will have the capability. And maybe just knowing that would also reinforce having the will to continue to resist Chinese expansionism. And one case is Taiwan. It's a very interesting case that you do talk about at some length. A lot of analysts look at the military balance between mainland China and Taiwan and see a huge shift toward the People's Republic, and they're much less confident, at least some of these analyses, that China, that Taiwan would be able to resist China. How do you feel about that?
I think that's generally correct.
Interesting blog post here by the owners of a brewery. They said they've had to furlough all their employees. They want to hire them back as soon as they can. They're able to give them a couple of weeks severance pay. And then as for the personal costs that they've been slashing, so I slashed my ESPN Plus subscription. I slashed my Sling TV subscription. So ESPN Plus cost me about $6 or $7, $8 a month. My Sling subscription cost me about $50, $60 a month. What else did I slash? I canceled my subscription to The Athletic because I'm not going to be watching sports for quite a while. And so other people cutting satellite TV, Spotify, 401k plan, dental insurance, auto insurance, janitorial service, workers' compensation, Netflix, software packages, and soon the internet. You're right, so there's little deliberation in all this. Every one of these threatens our survival by burning cash, and survival is all that matters. We switched our healthcare from a traditional insurer to a cost-sharing plan. A lot of Christians have cost-sharing plans. And this switch cut monthly health costs by more than 50%. Do we really need dental insurance? No. That's what this one owner of a brewery has done in response to shutdown.
Military balance has definitely shifted very much in China's favor. However, I think that China still hasn't is still pretty far from the threshold where it could actually conquer Taiwan. Because at the end of the day, it's really hard to conquer a developed island nation. So an amphibious invasion, for example, is the hardest mission in war. China currently doesn't have the transport craft. It would need to land a big...
So for months, I've been running this ad for preparewithluke.com, whereby people could buy 3 months supply of food for about $90. It's dried, and so what you have to do is add water and cook it in a microwave. Now the place that's been selling this has just been flooded with orders. I mean, that's a pretty good deal. 3 months supply of food for $90 in tough times. That seems like a reasonable purchase.
Army on Taiwan, even if it had those craft, Taiwan has very advanced missile forces that could basically pick off Chinese landing craft as they putter across the Taiwan Strait. So that would be a very difficult mission. An alternative option would be for China to try to starve Taiwan into submission through a blockade. But China, I explained in the article, would have a lot of difficulty sustaining a tight blockade of Taiwan for more than a few weeks. And even if it was able to totally cut Taiwan off, history suggests that blockades pretty much never work. Because modern countries can adapt to supply shortages, and civilian populations, when they get blockaded, they tend to get very angry. They tend to react with defiance and rally around their home government and basically stick it to the foreign invader. They're willing to endure enormous punishment to defy a foreign invader. And Taiwan has already built up this massive network of shelters stocked with food and fuel and medical supplies. So it doesn't give the impression that it's just going to roll over. And in the article, I argue it could hold out under a blockade for months.
And shocking from Bloomberg, China has concealed the extent of the coronavirus outbreak in its country, underreporting both total cases and deaths. The U.S. intelligence community has concluded in a classified report. Chadwick Moore tweets, "It's basic dictator math. Good news you can divide by 5, bad news multiply by 1,000. Everybody knew China was lying from day one, except those globalist bitches we call journalists who published Chinese Communist Party talking points and fixated on racism."
We'll see what readers in Taiwan have to say about your article. Another area in which you apply your military analysis is the general question of the East China Sea, where China and Japan have competing claims to various islands of various sizes. And I just wonder, what does the military analysis lead you?
Okay, New York Times columnist Fahad Manjoo wrote January 29, "Beware the pandemic panic. Coronavirus is scary, but how we respond to it may be worse." And then he wrote January 16, "There's nothing wrong," January 16, 2019, "There's nothing wrong with open borders. Why a brave Democrat should make the case for vastly expanding immigration."
You to conclude there?
I think here again, there's kind of a mixed bag. So I think the balance of sort of naval tonnage, just in terms of like number of ships, size of ships, is shifting gradually in China's favor. But I argue in the piece that Japan has enduring geographic and technological advantages. So its main geographic advantage is that it controls the Ryukyu Islands, which is this chain of islands that stretches the entire length of the East China Sea, all the way from the Japanese home islands to Taiwan. And Japan is planning to put mobile missile launchers on those islands that can target aircraft and ships pretty much anywhere in the eastern half of the East China Sea. And then on top of that, Japan, has world-class submarines, has world-class anti-submarine warfare forces. It's bringing into service 5th-generation stealth combat aircraft. And right now, it still has more than twice the number of big battleships of China. So it's a formidable force and be very hard for China to overcome.
In the South China Sea, there have been many reports in recent months and recent years of China taking a more assertive role, building artificial islands or expanding existing islands and establishing a military presence. It seems as though there's a big asymmetry here when you first look at it between China and countries like Vietnam, Malaysia, Singapore, and so on. What do you argue about the balance in the South China Sea?
I mean, China is much more powerful than each of these countries, but again, distance works in their favor. And, a lot of these countries, they can't project power and sort of conquer territory, but I argue that at least some of them can plausibly deny China its territorial claims near their borders. So it's patchy in the South China Sea. So on the western part of the South China Sea, you have Vietnam, which actually has a pretty strong denial force. So they can probably threaten aircraft and ships within a couple hundred miles from their coastline. And that's...
Hey, Matt Stoller was seeing the severity of this pandemic way before most people. He's got an essay out, How Bad Antitrust Enforcers Kill People. New York Times had an important story about the ventilator market a few days ago, reporting why a government effort to stock up on the machines after the SARS epidemic failed. 2006, in an attempt to learn what might happen should a SARS-like disease hit here, civil servants in government decided to stockpile ventilators. They wanted both more ventilators and better ventilators that were on the market. So the government found a small innovative corporation called Newport Medical and contracted with the corporation to design a better and cheaper version. First, the project seemed on track, but in 2012, Covidien, a large medical device manufacturer and distributor, bought up Newport Medical, canceled the federal contract, shut down Newport's ventilator line of business. The result is, in 2020, we don't have enough ventilators in a pandemic. So there are three failures of policy here. There's an antitrust failure. Covidien wanted to buy out a competitor who is producing ventilators more efficiently, more cheaply. Second is that roll-ups were part of a broader consolidation trend in the medical manufacturing industry in general. The merger should have been blocked on many different grounds, the simplest being the killer acquisition theory. The roll-up of device makers that Covidien pursued was part of a long-standing consolidation in the medical industry that correlated to consolidation more broadly. Because our antitrust laws focus on low consumer prices, what has happened across the economy is the creation of power buyers. Most people looking at monopolies who make commodities, say steel, believe a monopoly market manifests itself by how much the company can raise the price of what it sells, but monopolies can operate on the buying side too. Walmart is a buying monopoly, is able to use its market power to push prices down against suppliers and workers. So there's a Walmartization of the medical industry as hospitals combine purchasing power in cartels called group purchasing organizations. And Clinton administration said that they would not be subject to antitrust prosecution. Just 4 GPOs, group purchasing organizations, account for 90% of generic pharmaceutical purchasing. They also handle medical devices. Today, hospitals, pharmaceuticals, chemical inputs for drugs, medical devices, nearly every aspect of our medical supply chain is consolidated and fragile. The ventilator story is just the best example of what that means in real terms in a pandemic. Then the final notable aspect is a failure of government procurement policy. Civil servants in the ventilator episode were proactive and skilled and were on the verge of getting the ventilators we need. The effort went south, not because of anything the civil servants did wrong, but it was inadequate enforcement of antitrust legislation that allowed a consolidation of medical equipment suppliers. Laws that stripped power from contracting officers, civil servants, made it much harder to shape markets through procurement. The government had no ability to take the research it had paid for, give that to another contractor, or just do the work itself. We didn't have the rights to products developed with taxpayer money. That money and research evaporated. The net effect is we don't have enough ventilators. A lot of lessons here. The first is don't allow illegal mergers to consolidate power over product markets. Don't let consolidation happen throughout industries in general. Make sure that when the government pays for research and development, it can serve as a latent competitive threat if its contractors get bought out.
It's not nothing. I mean, that's like a third, that's the western third of the South China Sea that's effectively covered by these forces. So they have shore-based anti-ship missile launchers. They have state-of-the-art air defenses, and they have dozens of ships and aircraft that are armed with advanced cruise missiles. So Vietnam, it can't project power, but it could plausibly deny China coverage there. In the south part of the sea, Indonesia and Malaysia are much weaker than China, but the areas of the sea they claim are more than 1,000 miles away from China. And China's military, it has strong arms, but it has weak legs. So it has powerful missile forces, but it lacks a lot of the power projection assets you would need to sustain major combat operations at that kind of distance. So in the article, I argue that China probably couldn't sustain more than a dozen ships and aircraft in like a high tempo, high intensity combat situation there. So its forces would be cycling back and forth, whereas Indonesia or Malaysia in a war there, they border the contested regions and would have their full arsenal. Now, the eastern part of the South China Sea, especially the northeastern quadrant by the Philippines, is basically, it's open season for China there because the Philippines effectively has no meaningful air force or navy. So if China wanted to park a naval armada in those waters and start dictating terms, there's very little the Philippines could do about it. And if the United States were to intervene there, it would be fighting on its own, most likely.
Well, that may be one exception to your more general analysis about the current balance of capabilities between China and its regional neighbors. But there's another larger question too, and that is, if you look at the trends and look to the future, are we going to see a rapid shift toward much more favorable balance from the Chinese point of view? China is rapidly modernizing its military. It has a very large military budget, and it's developing better aircraft, a better navy. Is it going to be able to overcome the anti-access area denial capabilities of its neighbors?
I say no for three main reasons. One is that defense is just a lot cheaper than attack in these situations. So the asymmetric capabilities that China's neighbors need to deny China command of the seas and skies in their areas are 50 times cheaper on average than the power projection platforms China would need to actually enforce its territorial claims. So China needs aircraft carriers. It needs to start building nuclear-powered submarines that have the endurance to loiter in areas for extended periods of time. China's neighbors can hold parts of China's aircraft and navy at risk by putting, missile launchers on trucks or small ships. So it's just a lot cheaper. They're on the right side of the cost equation. The second issue is that China's economy, which is the motor behind its military modernization, is slowing. It's running out of steam. So since 2007, China's economic growth rates have been cut in half. Its debt has quadrupled to more than 300% of GDP at this point. And in the years ahead, money is only going to get tighter for China because China is aging more rapidly than any country in history because of the one-child policy. So right now, China has roughly 8 workers per retiree in its population. By 2050, it's going to be 2 workers per retiree, and a third of China's population is going to be over the age of 65. So estimates that I've seen suggest that China's going to have at least $10 trillion in unfunded pensions. It's going to have massive medical costs, lower productivity. So it's just not going to have the money to bankroll big-time military modernization. The last issue is homeland security costs. Homeland security missions drain a substantial chunk of China's military resources.
Looking at Twitter right now, Michael Savage asks, is the Wuhan virus our Pearl Harbor, a Trojan horse virus? Bill Gates calls for a complete national shutdown in an op-ed in the Washington Post. World Health Organization spends twice as much on travel as it does on medical supplies, according to its most recent financial report. And gun sales are up, handgun sales are up about 100%. Ammo shelves are bare. Kind of a sign of the times.
China, unfortunately for it, is located in a very rough neighborhood. It's got 19 countries around its borders, most of which are openly hostile towards China or unstable or both. It's basically imposed martial law in Tibet and Xinjiang to keep low-level insurgencies in check there. There's protests in Chinese cities. So to deal with all those threats, China allocates almost half of its active duty force and at least 35% of its military budget. So that obviously leaves very little left over for like a big push for maritime power projection.
In addition to looking at the military.
Okay, also looking on Twitter, Germany is considering asking everybody to use face masks. Surgeon General says, we've learned there's a fair amount of asymptomatic spread, and so we've asked the CDC to take another look at having more people wear face masks. So the highest-ranking U.S. health official has learned something that most people knew back in February. Low-carb feeding of ventilated ICU patients reduced time on ventilator by an average of 62 hours. Other benefits from low carbs include reduced respiratory rate, peak pressures, and CO2 levels. This could reduce ventilator need by about 12%, according to Paul Mason, MD, citing a recent study.
Capabilities and options for the states in the region. Your article makes recommendations for U.S. policy. You call for the United States to adopt something you call an active denial strategy. First of all, what exactly does that entail?
Active denial shifts the focus from where current policy is. So right now, the United States maintains a very visible, expensive presence. Basically, the goal of U.S. policy is to dominate East Asia militarily, and it's built it around aircraft carriers and destroyers and forward operating bases. And in wartime, the U.S. military basically plans to lead from the front and do most, if not all, of the heavy lifting. So, for example, some of the most detailed, unclassified war plans for a Taiwan scenario assume that Taiwan does nothing in its own defense, and that the U.S. military therefore has to launch an all-out air war against China to win back command of the skies over Taiwan. An active denial strategy would shift the focus away from trying to dominate unilaterally in East Asia to reinforcing the existing local balance of power in East Asia. So in peacetime, that means helping China's neighbors develop their denial capabilities, build up their militaries through arms sales, training, finance. And then in wartime, it would mean backing up local forces, so helping them.
Okay, so a movie streamer's guide to political literacy is a column from Jonah Goldberg. So what are the movies that he and his friends recommend? Casablanca, Lawrence of Arabia, The Godfather, A Clockwork Orange, and Silence of the Lambs. John Podhoretz, editor of commentary, offers The Lives of Others. Truly remarkable film, named the most conservative movie of all time by National Review. He writes, best political movie ever made is also the best movie of the 21st century, The Lives of Others. Made in 2006, but set in East Germany at the height of that communist regime's domination over its people, tells the story of the startling moral awakenings of a cold writer and a terrifying Stasi officer who holds the writer's life and the life of so many others in his hands. It is popular culture's most extraordinary portrait of totalitarianism, in part because it works so successfully as a gripping thriller. The movie isn't homework, it's everything a movie should be and could be, and it's everything a humanistic portrait of the evils of communism should be and could be. Then other recommended movies, Elmer Gantry. As Burt Lancaster is the ultimate evangelical grifter. He has so many analogies in American politics, I don't know where to start. And The Third Man is a reminder not to underestimate the power of sentiment and decency. We're meeting a lot of Harry Limes these days. And Blazing Saddles as a commentary on the nature of political discourse. Peter Suderman, who writes for Reason magazine, nominates Taxi Driver. Set the stage for the angry white young man archetype that continues to be part of American political and cultural discourse. Travis Bickle got red-pilled. Christine Rosen, Commentary Magazine, recommends The Manchurian Candidate from 1962, Being There from 1979. For anyone under the age of 30 who thinks becoming a Davos attending pontificating thought leader is a good life goal, Think of Chance the Gardener wandering cluelessly through the halls of power, saying things like spring is a time for planting, being declared a genius for doing so. Also, election 1999, for every political pundit who complains that there aren't enough female role models for all those little girls Elizabeth Warren had to break her pinky promises to when she ended her presidential campaign, I give you Tracy Flick. Flick is more of an anti-hero. She's also a warning for those who assume that women with power will exercise it less ruthlessly than men. Rob Long recommends The In-Laws, 1979 version, Best Years of Our Lives, the 1946 film. Failsafe, 1964. Story is simple. We accidentally bomb the Soviets and have to decide how to make it up to them. And The Dead Zone, 1983. Christopher Walken at his weirdest, Martin Sheen at his most manic, Assassinations, Psychic Powers, Nuclear Armageddon, and the New Hampshire primaries. Then other movies recommended: Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance, Face in the Crowd, Sidney Lumet's 1976 masterpiece Network, Dr. Strangelove, or How I Learned to Stop Worrying and Love the Bomb, and Wag the Dog. Okay, some recommended movies for gaining political literacy. Back to this podcast interview with Professor Michael Beckley. The topic, the emerging military balance in East Asia.
With logistics, with targeting, and if absolutely necessary, limited air and missile strikes on Chinese forces that are attacking China's neighbors. So Chinese forces that are beyond China's shores, not those on the homeland. And this strategy, I think, has two benefits. One is it still maintains a robust deterrent against China because it denies China the possibility of a decisive military victory. But it also reinforces crisis stability because it reassures China that it's not going to suffer a massive attack on its homeland at the outset of a war.
If the United States is stepping back just a little bit, as you suggest, in an active denial strategy and letting the countries in the region really take the lead, how can those countries remain confident that the United States is going to continue to play this backstopping role? Mm-hmm. Because a lot of them openly express concern that the United States is losing interest and is retrenching from the whole East Asian theater.
Mm-hmm. I think first, the U.S. can just make this very explicit. It can be part of U.S. declaratory policy that we are here to bolster and backstop the balance of power here in East Asia, and you can rely on us to do that. In addition, you can reinforce those declaratory statements by, putting your money and your arms where your mouth is. So actually selling arms, engaging in exercises and training. The United States does this to some extent, but not to the extent that at least I would like to see.
Is the Trump administration moving in the right direction on this issue now?
So Trump's most recent East Asia tour, I think, reassured a lot of analysts like myself that, Trump wasn't going to totally write off East Asia, but, he pulled out of the TPP. He's expressed numerous times that, allies are going to have to do more of their fair share and the U.S. may not be there to bail them out. So he certainly introduced a great deal of uncertainty into U.S. security guarantees. And there are certain things that the U.S., even under the Obama administration, wasn't doing in East Asia that could really help reinforce this local balance of power.
What's the most important thing that the Trump administration should do now?
Mm-hmm. I think plugging the giant Philippine-sized hole in the containment barrier that exists right now. So, that means, helping the Philippines build up its Coast Guard and Navy. That means, getting U.S. military bases, air and naval bases in the Philippines up and running. And ideally, I would like to see U.S. missiles be put in the Philippines. So surface-to-air missiles and anti-ship missiles. Now those deployments, that would require a lot of patient, skillful diplomacy. So far, I haven't seen that from the Trump administration, but hopefully things will change in the years ahead.
Well, we can only hope that things will change and that people...
Okay, so there was one United States senator who was way ahead of the curve on this and many other stories. His name is Tom Cotton. So here's National Review by John McCormick.
The senator who saw the coronavirus coming, National Review. Tom Cotton was both the first and the loudest voice in Congress to sound the alarm about the looming pandemic. While others slept, Tom Cotton was warning anyone who would listen that the coronavirus was coming for America. On January 22, one day before the Chinese government began a quarantine of Wuhan to contain the spread of the virus, the Arkansas senator sent a letter to Secretary of Health and Human Services Alex Azar encouraging the Trump administration to consider banning travel between China and the United States and warning that the communist regime could be covering up how dangerous the disease really was. That same day, he amplified his warnings on Twitter and in an appearance on the radio program of Fox and Friends host Brian Kilmeade. At the time, the Senate impeachment trial was dominating the news cycle. The trial, which lasted from January 16 to February 5, had even blotted out coverage of the Democratic presidential primary in the days leading up to the Iowa caucuses. When the first classified briefing on the virus was held in the Senate on January 24, only 14 senators reportedly showed up. Cotton's public and private warnings became more urgent that last week of January. In a January 28 letter to the Secretaries of State, Health and Human Services, and Homeland Security, he noted that no amount of screening, at airports, will identify a contagious but asymptomatic person afflicted with the coronavirus and called for an immediate evacuation of Americans in China and a ban on all commercial flights between China and the United States. Cotton first spoke to President Trump about the virus the next day. The Arkansas Gazette reported that he missed nearly 3 hours of the impeachment trial while he was discussing the matter with Trump administration officials. The outbreak was the biggest and the most important story in the world, he said in a Senate hearing that week. What tipped the senator off to the true nature of the threat? Why was he the first and the loudest voice in Congress to sound the alarm about the looming pandemic? In an interview with National Review, Cotton is quick to point out that he doesn't have a background in science or public health, but he does have two eyes. As a longtime China hawk, he found his interest piqued early on by reports primarily from East Asian news sources. Two things struck me about China's response, he says. First, their deceit and their dishonesty going back to early December. And second, the extreme draconian measures they had taken. By the third week of January, they had more than 75 million people on lockdown. They were confined to their homes and apartments, otherwise they were arrested. In some cases, the front doors of those buildings were welded shut. All schools had shut down. Hong Kong had banned flights from the mainland. These are the kind of extreme, draconian measures that you would only take in a position of power in China if you were greatly worried about the spread of this virus. On January 31, the president announced a ban on entry to foreign travelers who had been in China in the previous 2 weeks, while allowing Americans and permanent residents to continue to travel back and forth between the two countries. The measure was not as stringent as Cotton's call for a ban on all commercial flights, but Cotton points out that the president did not have many advisors encouraging him to shut down travel. Advisors who were supportive tended to be national security aides, he adds, while most of his economic and public health advisors were ambivalent at best about the travel ban. I commend the president greatly for ultimately making the right decision contrary to what the so-called experts were telling him, he says. Of course, while the travel restriction may have bought the United States time, that time was largely squandered by the catastrophic failure of the CDC and FDA to ramp up testing for the coronavirus in the United States.
Okay, so what do conference calls look like in real life? Okay, that's pretty funny. Pretty accurate representation of what conference calls are like in real life. Let me look at my Twitter here. Bibi Netanyahu says Israel recommends all Israelis wear a mask when going outside. If they don't have a mask, they should cover their faces with a scarf. United States is expelling border crosses to Mexico in an average of 96 minutes during the pandemic. So that's a massive increase over normal. Jose Rosado tweets, how to make yourself indestructible. Surround yourself with winners. Ignore toxic people. Focus on yourself. Build up your discipline. Put a deadline on your goals. Learn how to make money every day. Promote your services prolifically. Fix your diet and lift some weights. Back to National Review article on the senator who saw the coronavirus coming, Tom Cotton.
In phone calls and meetings in early February, Cotton says he encouraged the administration to be very aggressive and very flexible when it came to testing and diagnostic protocols. One consistent thing I had seen in the literature from past outbreaks is that the FDA and especially the CDC is unfortunately somewhat slow to act in these circumstances. I did discuss that with the president. I discussed it with Jared Kushner. I discussed it a lot with Robert O'Brien, the National Security Advisor, and O'Brien's deputy, Matthew Pottinger. The CDC should not have acted like know-it-all bureaucrats who had the only medical and scientific expertise to develop tests. We have lots and lots of very capable labs all around the country, Cotton adds. The FDA should not put all of its eggs in the CDC basket. They were slow to use their emergency use authorization. In a January 26 appearance on Face the Nation, Cotton called on the FDA to expedite approval for testing to state and local governments. The bureaucracy just didn't move as fast as it could have, he says. Dr. Fauci said it's not the president's fault. It would have happened to any other president. But it was a lost opportunity, given the time the president bought everyone with the travel restriction. Does the president ultimately bear responsibility for the failures at the CDC and FDA? He is the president, and it's always the president's job to push the bureaucracy when they're...
Okay, that's National Review article there on Tom Cotton, the senator who saw this thing coming before anyone else. Right, Cotto Gottfried. Go.
Area. And so this whole thing really boiled over from the Donald Trump presidency. Suburban voters are like Miranda in the 2018 Georgia gubernatorial election. White female voters supported the Republican candidate for governor, Brian Kemp, who's now the governor, by 2 percentage points more than white males did. So, you know, we don't want to get carried away here, but there is a shift among certain sectors of the female white suburban vote in the South, and it's part of a broader trend throughout the country and even throughout the Western world. One sees the same thing happening in Canada, the United Kingdom, and Australia. New Zealand as well, I'm sure. So anyhow, I think I have said enough here. Paul, please share your opening thoughts on the article and what it means to you.
Well, I think you may have asked the wrong person to discuss it. I should not have been, but I was appalled by this woman, by her self-indulgence, her silliness, her sense of self-importance. I would like to think that if she had children, which she didn't, she probably would have become more mature by the age of 39. But apparently Liz, who had been married to a conservative Republican evangelical and who dumped the husband, had 2 kids. And this did not keep her from going over the edge emotionally. I have to say, one of the things I thought was amazing about Liz, this is not Miranda, it's the lady who was who corrupted her. Although I suspect it wasn't very much to corrupt. But Liz apparently had the entry drug for Liz in becoming a leftist was reading Dostoevsky. Well, I could not imagine any thinker in the history of the Western world who would be less inclined to push somebody toward the left than Dostoevsky. He was a Russian nationalist, a fervent member of the Russian Orthodox faith, who denounced Catholics and Jews as being somehow inferior to the Russians and the Russian Orthodox. And his books are always about spiritual conversions to Christianity. Now, I have no idea how Liz, who was apparently turning her back on Christianity and becoming a social radical, would in any way have been influenced in this direction by reading Dostoevsky. I have to say that something else that I noticed about the article is that Ron Dreher is not a particularly persuasive critic of Liz or of Miranda, because he seems generally to agree with them, that this world of evangelical Southern Christian who vote for Trump are limited, parochial, create a stifling sexist environment. He seems to buy into all of this. He does seem to have sympathy for Phil, but Phil seems to be such a, I don't know, I'm thinking of a German expression, Weichei, like a soft egg or something. I mean, he does not seem to be particularly manly. He just goes along with what the wife does. I mean, if this is the best that we can do, you know, in finding reactionary rednecks, this is not very good.
I was going to say that Phil, I imagine most of those watching this, if not all, have not read the article, which appeared originally in the Washington Post, but it was reposted at MSN, and that's where the link is to. But Phil is Miranda's husband. And he comes from a well-to-do family that's well-established in Augusta, but he still chose to marry this woman who he said was very different from other women he had met. And obviously her marrying him brought her some degree of social prominence, but it does not seem to be in any way, shape, or form influencing her behavior now, which is strange because traditionally women, as well as men, who have married into more socially prominent families have sort of not tried to rock the boat because they don't want to alienate these socially prominent people who, by association with them, it's good for the person who married into their clan, so to speak. But this woman, Miranda, doing the opposite of not rocking the boat, it's quite astounding to me, really. It is that there's not a social influence here that would guide her to act differently, which has traditionally been the case. But Paul, anything to say about that?
Well, the other thing that I found remarkable is that Ron Dreher, who took this piece and embellished it or embroidered it for his own purposes, agrees that it is terrible to be in an evangelical church where these people voted for Donald Trump. Now, I can't. Who were they supposed to vote for? It was a vote for the candidate who wants to give sex change hormones to their kids in elementary school, who want to protect a woman's right to kill her infant even after it's born, or even after the third trimester. I would expect anyone who believes in traditional morality, biblical morality, to in that situation, to vote for Trump, however imperfect and loudmouth he may seem. His views are much more in line with traditional Judeo-Christian morals than the views of the opposite party. I mean, I'm not quite sure why Phil was a bad guy for voting for Donald Trump. Sort of given the choices that he faced. I also find it interesting that Miranda was brought over to the view that she's not for abortion; she's just for a woman's right to choose. The woman has a right to choose an abortion, and that's what the woman's right to choose is about. I mean, so I mean, you can just see how morally and intellectually weak these people are. The one who disgusted me the most, was actually Phil. He seemed to go along with anything the wife did as long as she stayed with him. I like to believe that Miranda is an absolutely beautiful woman, and Phil, looks like a geek or something like that. Because the degree of permissiveness that he shows in this relation is absolutely astounding or appalling.
Well, it's interesting because I did see a picture of Miranda in the MSN article, and well, I wouldn't categorize her as a Revlon model. We'll just leave it at that. Yeah. And I saw a picture of her husband as well, and he looks like a pretty standard 30 or 40 something Southern guy. I don't think there's nothing remarkable about him in a positive or negative sense. So I don't think he really has to be putting up with this, but he is. He's from what I can tell, he's a very tolerant, very decent man with a kind heart. But unfortunately, this precise personality type is often manipulated by other people. So I'll just leave that there. But insofar as Miranda goes, it's also worth mentioning that her friend Liz took her to a female burlesque show, and apparently all these women who have a group called the Coven, they actually call it the Coven, it's sort of like a meeting, I guess, of progressive women in the Augusta area. It just didn't seem to me like what you'd expect of a married woman to do when she's out on the town. The whole story, to me, it has many different dimensions, and it's quite something else, to say the least.
I think it has many different dimensions, all of them equally bad. I let's care for the narrator because he seemed generally to sympathize with this woman, that, and sort of knowing who he is, I'm not surprised, because he's somebody from a small town in Louisiana who sort of turned his own back on these, evangelical deplorables and sort of gone his own way. And even though he describes himself as conservative at one point, I have no idea what the word conservative means there, except that he writes occasionally for Conservatism Incorporated magazines. But there was nothing about this woman that indicated anything other than self-indulgence.
Okay, looking at Twitter right now, Mayor of LA says if you cannot pay your rent due to COVID-19, so whenever you're trying to get the special breaks due to this pandemic, you have to mention COVID-19. That's the magic word to get your break. Whether you're sick or you've been laid off due to the virus, you cannot be evicted during this emergency period, and you will have 12 months to repay back rent. It's the mayor of Los Angeles. Half of the coronavirus tests processed last night in New York came back positive, so 9,000 positives out of 18,000 tests. That's a very high percentage. The state is now at 76,000 cases. And Glenn Greenwald says he's starting to get increasingly uncomfortable about having Twitter and Facebook effectively decreeing what can and cannot be questioned and debated regarding this pandemic. And Joe Biden says states should be prepared for remote voting for the 2020 elections.
Yeah, it's interesting. And of course, as you mentioned, Dreher took the article and popularized it on his blog at the American Conservative. You understand what I'm getting at here?
Yes. No, I think you're right. I think he's overly indulgent. I also don't think he represents the best in Protestant moral tradition. You don't see the traditional Protestant moral austerity in him, the insistence on, raising a moral family. He seems to give this wife anything she wants. It's like he's so grateful she would marry him. There's something almost pathetic about his behavior. When I was, I don't know. I think she may be typical of college-educated women. I think you suggested this. She's not peculiar to the South. I think this is a more general trend. Although, if one looks at the senatorial race in Alabama in 2018, white suburban women, many of them Republican in places like Birmingham, did turn out and vote for Doug Jones against Moore. And I was surprised, and I'll take your word for this, that in Georgia, most white women voted for the Kemp, who was the Republican governor. But does that include the women who did not go to college, as well as the ones?
All women across the board.
All across the board, I believe that, because of the ones who are not infected by college sociology courses or women's studies or whatever goes on.
So our elites are concerned that many people are not taking public transportation right now.
Slightly concerning, shows a slightly concerning trend, because we have seen an uptick in motor vehicle traffic. So the message here really is people do need to stay at home, and most are doing the right thing, as you can see from the rapid decline in public transport use. So everyone needs to do that. The message here is we need to save lives and protect the NHS. So please stay at home.
So why is it concerning that people sensibly choose to travel by car on their own and not on limited and overcrowded public transportation during a virus pandemic? So this professor, Yvonne Doyle, medical director of Public Health England, says it's very concerning that people don't want to ride public transport and expose themselves to the virus. Pretty sick position. We go back to Colin Wilfried.
Would probably be less inclined to go in this direction. The other thing I thought was interesting is that most of the women I have known who flipped the way Miranda did, who engaged in this volte face and just go off in that direction, are doing it for professional reasons. I've known female academics who start out as right-wingers and then land up as politically correct left-wingers, but they do this to fit in and to get promotions and to advance in their work. Miranda obviously was not doing it for that reason. It was just that, she was looking to liberate herself from something or other.
So I read something from an interview with Jonah Bennett, and he's a publisher. He said, I read yesterday, aesthetics is one of the more important points in political theory because it's one of the most immediate, legible, and visceral. There's certainly more philosophical and social science elements of political theory, but people are much more likely to sort based on how they aesthetically and socially assess a particular political theory and its relationship to how they conceive of themselves. Is it pro-system or anti-system? Is it high status or low status? Are the people who instantiate the theory good or evil or interesting or boring? Is it filled with people like them? Does it put forward a future they view as meeting their social and psychological needs? Does it have a community? Is it going anywhere? How do other people I care about view it? What does embracing this political theory say about me? These are psychological and aesthetic questions, and for most people, they tend to be prior to questions of pure theory. And if the aesthetic is juvenile, it will attract juveniles. If the aesthetic is dark and dangerous and evil, it will tend to attract the dark, dangerous, and evil. On the other hand, if it has a confident, earnest, and responsible self-conception, it will tend to attract people who feel similarly. Go back here to Paul Gottfried.
I thought the citation of Doll's House, or the references to Doll's House by Ibsen, was appropriate. It's like at the end, Nora is discovering herself, and she leaves. And as the German philosopher of history Oswald Spengler said, that when she closed that door, the entire history of gender relations just changed. It was like some enormous crash game. And I think what he was saying was this was sort of this presaged changes that were going to occur, in the general society. Nora represents a type that she has all these things, but she's sort of like living in a doll's house, has to discover herself. But I would imagine that the world that Ibsen was describing, which was Norway in 1880, offered women fewer options than they have now. Why should Miranda feel so deprived? She can do anything she wants, including going off the deep end, which is what she does.
It's a profoundly interesting story, not just because of the people associated with it, but because, I guess, of what it says about society on the whole and the lack of female.
There was a social historian, Ed Shorter, who wrote on the condition of middle-class women in the 19th century and said it was pretty damn good. I mean, look at Laura's situation. The woman is hardly starving. She's living very well. But obviously she does not feel, fulfilled as a woman or as an individual or something. So she leaves the poor husband, the poor jerk, and she slams the door and goes out. There's no reason to assume she really is, being deprived or is. People back then were hunting for food, were living at subsistence level. And this woman is living in a very luxurious life. So, one has to be a dedicated feminist to see in Nora, a victim of brutal sexism or anything of the kind.
And we've spoken about Miranda, and before we get into the broader political, I guess, implications of this and cultural implications of this, and after that we'll get to the questions. The chat is popping tonight. Very cool, guys. Thank you.
Or Jonathan Edwards, Stone Jackson. Now, he is sort of a weak type, but I'm sure he's a very nice man, and he's very considerate about his wife. And I think he sort of represents a high level, one might say, of social refinement. But I think, as Montesquieu and others pointed out back in the 18th century, when he spoke about a ramollissement des manières, a kind of softening of manners, that it just goes too far. And, he's a person who has been emasculated by his refinement. He lets his wife walk all over him and destroy their lives and so forth. And one can feel sorry for him. One can even like Phil and even recognize that he's probably a kind, decent man. But I think his weakness, which you see in other men of his class today, is extremely dangerous and is destructive of any kind of family cohesion and gender roles. And this, people like this represent the very death of the family.
It's worth noting that Phil, when he married Miranda, or before that, he knew she was different than most other women he had known, and I think he was attracted to that. I think the implication is that she was more, shall we say, wise to the ways of the world than Phil was. Paul, anything to say about this?
I was thinking of the word "it's a fast woman," which was the expression that was used when I was young. I think you have some insight there. That he obviously was. A sort of a diffident young man. He probably had very little experience of women, and he probably looks better than she does. But the fact that she was sort of experienced in these areas, and that she was giving him a tumble was very important in his life. And he certainly signed on for trouble. I said I feel sorry for him. One of the things I do know people exactly like that, and they land up marrying decent men who think that this is fine. They're very often men who need a strong woman or a strong woman's hand. They just have the wrong woman. Thinking of neighbors of mine, and who barely speak to me because they consider me to be a fascist. They don't like my basset hound. I have neighbors. They work at the local. Turkey Hill, I don't know what the equivalent is where you are, but it's sort of a store you go into and buy items cheaply. And French, I know in Quebec it's called débrailleur, but it's like Turkey Hill or 7-Eleven. And the lady who works, she and her husband live right behind this neighbor. And although this neighbor is an atheist, she told their kids that the parents are going to hell because they voted for Trump. Now, here's a woman who doesn't even believe in God. She hates her mother, who's a devout Protestant, Republican, and so forth. One of the things I find remarkable, she hates Trump as a sexist. If I hated Trump as a sexist, though, why would I vote for Hillary Clinton, who covered up her husband's rape to all those years and went after the victims of his rape?
Looking at Daily Beast, Trump literally laughed at how he can game the press with his new tone. The president is acutely aware that if he acts in somber fashion, the media will quickly notice and praise him for it. So yesterday's news conference, he was just generally somber, even dour. And afterwards, the press noted the difference in tone, with various pundits speculating that the gravity of the moment was finally weighing on the man in the Oval Office. And James Woods tweets, in every major news event, cell phone videos invariably materialize. Every shooting, fire, earthquake, tornado. Where are the videos of the hospitals being overwhelmed with patients? Something is creepy, wrong, and very scary about this entire event. And VDAD tweets, the China virus is the ultimate stress test of the elite's mandated belief that diversity is our greatest strength. Here's the New York Fire Department alerting residents not to call 911 except if there's an emergency in 8 different languages. And Hungary's far-right leader Viktor Orban has been granted power to rule by decree. He immediately moves to strip away transgender rights. Sad. How are the transgender doing in Hungary?
Yeah, I hear this all the time. That, people voted for him because I couldn't stand Trump's sexism. At least this woman voted for this this druggie or whatever it was, Gary Johnson. It's like shown taking marijuana or something, but at least did not vote for Hillary. I give her credit for that. She voted, threw her vote away. I voted.
I was going to say that. It's interesting because a lot of these women who hate Trump viscerally, they relate Trump to some bad male experience within their life, and I think they impose whatever man wrong.
Oh yeah, this is so true. This is so true. I know one woman who stopped all this necessary medical treatment that she was receiving because she was so convinced that Trump would destroy the healthcare system, and that somehow something which hasn't eventuated 3 years and 3 months since Trump took power, but she's absolutely feels assured that her decision to stop this necessary medical treatment during the 2016 election that she desperately needs, but she stopped it because she was convinced that, Trump would end Obamacare's rule that you can't refuse to take on people with pre-existing conditions. So that's why she quit this needed medical treatment, and now Donald Trump just kind of embodies her father for her. So she has a lot of negative feelings about her father. Donald Trump reminds her of her father, and to reinforce her own hatred of Donald Trump, she's convinced that he will destroy the healthcare system. Therefore, she's quit getting all this necessary medical treatment.
Them onto Donald Trump himself. And this is something that I've seen happening with a lot of different women, not just in the South. Why do you think this is, Paul, that so many women associate Trump with some man who did something unfortunate toward them, and then they impose this anger on Trump, like I said, and it winds up guiding their politics? This, to me, is a truly fascinating turn of events.
Well, I think you credit these people with more consistency than I see in any of them. I mean, they don't seem to mind Democrats who rape women. We can prove this. They don't mind Hillary Clinton consorting with Harvey Weinstein. They do not hold any of these things against Democrats, but they scream against Kavanaugh to this very day. I mean, Kavanaugh is an evil man who raped some woman, although none of this can be shown. I think a lot of it has to do with ideological loyalties, and you simply, project onto the party you don't like because it's the more you view it as the more conservative party. All of these bad traits, sexism, homophobia, and so forth. I think this is basically what's going on here. It's just like, you said that I voted, someone says I voted for Obama because I voted for a black president, and the people who voted against him didn't want a black president. Well, if I ask these same people, do you like Clarence Thomas? There was a black justice. Oh, I hate him. He's a traitor to my race. Did you vote for this Republican black? Oh, no, that person's not a black. See, pretty soon you discover that it's really not about it. Race is just the icing on the cake. What they are concerned about is loyalty to the Democratic Party, right? And I think the same thing is true with these women who are deeply offended by Trump and are also willing to attribute all kinds of, I remember, sexism to this Mitt Romney. I heard the same thing about Mitt Romney because he was a Republican, therefore he's a sexist. So I think it has to do with party loyalty. And, in the case of Trump, you got somebody who looks like a sexist, who behaves, who talks like one. So, you lucked in. But even if he was some poor jerk,
who was scared of women, he would still be a sexist, and Clinton would not be a sexist because Clinton is a Democrat and this guy's a Republican. So I think it really, you still don't get these. Kirsten Gillibrand for years served the Clintons. Didn't see, and the guy was a known rapist, and he was fine. Then she was screaming against Kavanaugh. We cannot have this man because he raped some woman or something. Well, it has to do with party politics. I think the sexism and all the other stuff is just secondary. It also has to do with abortion rights. If you're in favor of the most extreme abortion rights, like you can have an abortion anytime you want, even if the baby is 6 years old, you can abort it or something. That's good. You expand abortion rights, so that shows you're not a sexist, even if you went out and raped women the day before, right? So I'm not sure that we're really talking about women who are that turned off by Donald Trump's sexism, given the fact that they're quite happy to put up with sexists, in the other party, with rapists, and so they don't mind this at all, because those people are good on abortion. The best example was Teddy Kennedy, who was an absolute monster with women, and women loved him because he voted the right way on abortion.
Okay, interesting essay here by Noah Millman in The Week. Coronavirus's profound threat to democracy. So many of the ways that states expanded their power during wartime had legitimate purposes related to war fighting. The battle with coronavirus presents the state with an awesome set of new powers and responsibilities, fully comparable to those of wartime mobilization. In high-trust societies with capable states like South Korea or Denmark, strict measures win support across the political spectrum. Social solidarity can both support their implementation and act as a check on state abuse of these new powers. But in lower trust societies, and particularly in societies like America's that are profoundly divided, this is far less likely to be the case. In Hungary, the legislature has granted President Orban extraordinary emergency powers to rule by decree. From Israel to Chile to Thailand, regimes around the world are using new powers to protect themselves from public scrutiny while claiming to be protecting the public. It's a recipe not only for the erosion, but the outright end of democracy. In wartime, loose lips sink ships, but the coronavirus has no ears. States will have to be as transparent and communicative as possible to encourage public participation in defeating the virus. Trust in government is one of the most important and undervalued weapons in this fight. The only way for the government to earn the people's trust is for the government to trust the people in turn. So, diversity does not make it easier to trust, to build social trust. As the coronavirus rages, Ruth Bader Ginsburg is working out at the Supreme Court gym. She's got a trainer. The trainer says, except for Ruth Bader, they would have closed up shop. Because Ruth Bader wants to keep working out there in the gym, they're keeping it open for her. Okay.